I'm really so pleased to see all of you here in St. Louis. A beautiful day, but this is going to really be a wonderful event. So thank you for coming. I'm Regis O'Keefe. I'm the chair of orthopedics at Washington University. I'll be serving as one of the judges, and Dr. David Brogan. David, why don't you stand up for a second? I'll interrupt your breakfast. David Brogan will be a judge as well, and David, his role in our residency program is he leads our research, he directs our research for the residency. So really important role. He works closely with Alexander Lehman. Alexander may be someone here. Alexander's in the back. Alexander, thank you as well for being a judge. Alexander is our program director and is also the vice chair for education in Washington University. So just want to give a little bit of an introduction about where you are today with Washington University. But first of all, recognize where you come from. You know, these are all fantastic places that support research, and you're very fortunate to be there. And we're very interested to hear what you've accomplished in your research programs and activities at these various institutions. We thank your program chairs and directors, department chairs and directors for allowing you to be here with us. This is our faculty here. Altogether, we have over 100 faculty members now in Washington University. This is the group that showed up at 6 a.m. and I'm always amazed that they're smiling. Even the attendings can smile at 6 a.m. And then this is our residents. And again, 6 a.m., I think this is probably later in the day for our residents. They've been at work already, but you see myself and Alexander. Zach Meyer is also pictured. Zach is our associate program director. One thing you see is that we've had a real commitment to diversity in our program. Half of the residents at Washington University are women. This year we matched 5 women and 4 men. And we have had a really strong commitment to those that are from underrepresented backgrounds, with more than 30% of our residents being from underrepresented backgrounds in medicine. So really proud of the way that our residents create an environment of collaboration. In terms of our department, we really do focus on our vision and mission. This is shown at all our grand rounds, all our major conferences. Residents see this all the time. We refer to it because this defines who we are, how we are committed to clinical care, education, and research, but more importantly, how we want to work together. It's about how I think success is around building teams, and so that part on the right around developing that environment where everyone can achieve and do it in collaboration is so important. And this is a shortened version that sometimes we show. And again, the real truth element of success, and I think you've seen this as well and where you are, is that you never do research alone. It's always in teams. And so that team and respect and collaboration that make it possible to have success is critical. So just to summarize about the department, we're number 3 in NIH funding. Our residency program is ranked number 4. Those of you from Mayo, you're ahead of us. I think you're number 2, but we'll keep trying. We're going to keep trying as well. But we do want to recognize your residency program. We have 100 faculty members. If I send an email to everyone in the department, it's about 650 people. We're going to do over 20,000 surgeries, 220,000 patient visits, and we're at 12 locations. I think one of the key things I'm very proud of is the number of publications in the department. We had 428 publications last year. That's an extraordinary number. Many very high quality publications that are impacting the field. Now, a lot of this has been due to the OREF, their support. And I do want to recognize Lee Grossman's in the first seat here. So Lee is watching. He's the Chief Executive Officer. Lee has a really distinguished background in the field of orthopedics and joined the OREF in 2019, leads that effort that has been so important. And more to come on that in a few slides about what they do and how they support research, and particularly development clinician scientists. John Johnson's here as well, Peter Bradenthal, and then Carmen Montoya. Carmen have been many years. I've known Carmen for many years, so always wonderful to see her. And you met her, I think, as you came in possibly to the front desk. But what has the OREF meant? And I can just tell you from my own personal experience. I started my career, and I didn't have a startup package. I went to, I trained at the University of Rochester, I did an oncology fellowship at Harvard, and then my early funding was from the OREF. And I had a couple of grants. I had a career development grant as I wrote during my last year of residency. So I entered with a career development grant. And then you can see how that little bit of funding at the beginning was so critical for me to leverage with getting a research program started, and then expanding on that. And altogether, that's led to $31 million and counting from my research activities and laboratories. So, this really has meant a lot to me. I've always been committed to OREF. I've given a donation every year since really the early 90s, and I'm very proud to make sure that that happens each year. And I encourage you all to contribute as well as you get on your career. So, and that has also been really significant for us to help us, so many of our faculty members. You can hear from Cecilia. Cecilia has been a recipient of numerous grants, but now leveraging them into NIH awards, and more to come as I introduce her later. But our department has been very successful in leveraging that funding. I do want to mention a little about orthopedics and how we value research here. So I came in 2014, and I credit my predecessor, Richard Gellerman, for this. There was an article that was in a Journal of Orthopedic Trauma in 2018. I simply asked the question, what are the top orthopedic programs in the United States, academic programs in the United States? Used a number of criteria, publications. They looked at the number of leaders in the department and different societies, organizations. And you can see that at that time, this was data from 2005 to 15, so a 10-year period. WashU is number 3, MGH, HSS, Mayo, UPMC, and others that are listed there. And so we're really proud. This is a program that I took on as a chair, again, following a tremendous leader, Richard Gellerman. This was then repeated a few years ago by Nick Bernthal. Nick is the chair at UCLA. In fact, Nick is going to be our graduation speaker this year. So Nick repeated this a few years ago. And you can see that things shifted a little bit. The same players are listed there, but Washington University at that time, 2022, had now achieved #1 ranking. And that's why I mentioned that 428 publications, something we're very proud of. You're going to hear from one of our faculty who you'll see the kind of quality work that we want to support, Cecilia, in a few minutes. So I thank you so much for being here. Your participation here means so much to us. And we hope that you leave here with a prize. We are going to have prizes for some of you that you'll be able to take home with you. And it actually is cash. It's actually cash, which is a nice prize. It's not a plaque. So really focus on those presentations. And I think now I'm going to turn it over to Lee. So Lee, please.
Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be here in St. Louis today. It is a beautiful day. It's a beautiful venue, and we're very, very proud to be associated with the Washington University in doing the Resident Research Symposium. This is our 25th year of doing these symposia. We've had a very distinguished long career. It's one of our signature events that we very, very much enjoy. This is our first one of 2026. We have 4 others scheduled this year. The next one's going to be in Orlando at Orlando Health at the Jewett Orthopedic Institute. We're doing the Mid-Atlantic Symposium in Baltimore, and it's co-sponsored by Johns Hopkins and the University of Maryland. Then we traveled to the West Coast to do one at the University of California, San Diego, and we finish up our regional symposiums at New York University. And then lastly, we will be doing a national resident symposium on November 18th that will be held virtually. So that rounds out our 2026 symposia this year. I'm going to be doing a little bit of housekeeping here, so please listen up for those that are presenting. We are not only recording this, but this is being broadcast live over the internet. So some of you might be able to find that and watch it on your laptops as the day progresses. So whenever you're talking, when the judges are asking their questions, when you're up here responding to those questions, please have the microphone so that not only do we catch the recording, but those that are watching online can hear. So we have 5 sections today. After your section, after you do your presentation, please sit in the front row. And when that section is completed, you'll be standing up front and the judges will be then asking you questions. So when you come up for your presentation, our crack AV team will be putting your presentation up on the screen. So that's something you don't have to worry about. After each one of the sections, please turn in your score sheets. We'll have OREF staff coming around. They're very diligent about collecting those. Today we have multiple prizes. The one for you to be probably most aware of and to hold your attention is that we have the Presenters Award. So those that are presenting today will be able to score the other presenters, and there'll be a prize for the one that you have selected, the presenters have selected, who, in your opinion, gave the best presentation. The judges will be awarding the third, second, and first place prizes, and there are cash prizes for those. The second place and first place winners will then be eligible to compete at the National Symposium, which, as I said, is going to be held virtually on November 18th. The grand prize winner of the National Resident Research Symposium then goes on, and their award is a all-expense paid trip to the AAOS meeting in March of 2027 in Las Vegas. So you get a nice trip to Vegas as a result of winning the top prize. So I'm going to do a little bit of talking about OREF, but first of all, I want to give some thank yous. As I said, we're very, very proud to be here. Thank you, Dr. O'Keefe, for hosting us here. Our keynote speaker is, I looked at her slides briefly, that she's going to be giving an incredible presentation that you'll hear after I'm done with this opening. And I want to thank our judges for taking the time and being here today to be involved with this. Also, we have our moderators here that are going to be running the various sections that we have. We want to thank our sponsors as well. They help make these symposia that we do around the nation possible, and that's DePuy Synthes, Zimmer, Biomet, and Smith+Nephew, as well as the Hark Family, who's been very, very generous over multiple years in supporting OREF in general and our Resident Research Symposia specifically. So what is OREF? We've been around for 70, and now it's our 71st year. We exist by the generosity of those of you that are in this room and other orthopedic surgeons primarily, and we are wholly supported by donations, and that independent funding that we receive allows us to be able to pursue without bias the best research that's presented to us, as well as to pursue the priorities that are most important at that time to the orthopedic specialty. That independence also allows us to be what we call body part agnostic. And as you'll see from a slide I'll show later, that our research covers all aspects of MSK research. We're also very collaborative. We collaborate with over 60 organizations in either helping manage their research or raising funds for their education and research as well. In 2025, we awarded approximately $4.1 million in support of ongoing grants and new grants. And one of our primary purposes, and that is a result also of what we're doing here in this in the symposia that we do, is that we want to nurture the pipeline of new clinical investigators. OREF was founded by orthopedic surgeons for orthopedic surgeons to address the severe need that we've had since our founding and currently to address the lack of clinical research and to support that and to incentivize those that want to, those clinicians that want to have research as part of their career. And we also see ourselves as a unifying force in the fact that we do fund all aspects of MSK issues, as well as our collaboration with over 60 organizations. As you can see from this pie chart, we, on any particular year, are funding just about every aspect of MSK issues. Over the last 5 years, we've put about $900,000 into educational programs for residents, and we have raised considerable amounts to support other organizations for their research and education as well. Our total mission support over the last 5 years has been over $19 million. These are the, as I had mentioned before, we survive by the generosity of orthopedic surgeons primarily, and are very grateful to our donors. And as part of that, we have departments that have committed every year to support ours, where just about all their faculties as en masse support OREF at the order of merit level. And as you can see here, these are the institutions and private physician groups that have supported OREF. Our impact has been well documented. Dr. O'Keefe referred to Nick Bernthal earlier and some of the work that he's been doing and looking at residency programs, and he's also did 2 studies for OREF looking at our impact. And we have a very, very proud history of those that receive OREF funding going on to receive greater funding from federal government and other foundation support. If you have a career development grant, for example, your chances of getting an OR1 are about 50%, which is incredible, and about 20% of those that we fund go on to get some sort of federal funding. And and we also, it's been documented showing that our resident grant recipients generally go on to pursue academic careers. About 64% of them go on to academic careers. And also, as you can see here, that our symposia play an important role in that, those winners also, the majority of them have pursued academic careers as well. What we've looked at are approximately 4,800 grants that we have funded over our history, and have found that many of what we've granted initially, have awarded initially, have gone on to significantly change clinical practice. And this is a very, very small sampling of some of the more significant people that we funded early on in their careers that went on to make a tremendous difference in clinical practice. Now, I'm going to shift here to one of the more important projects that OREF is now working on, and that is really looking at the burden of disease and musculoskeletal issues and the tremendous disparity that exists between what is that burden of disease and MSK research funding. MSK issues dominate healthcare. It's about $1 trillion issue annually in the U.S. And yet, as you can see from this slide, which is not moving, that slide, in comparison to almost any other medical specialty, we receive what I'll refer to as pittance of federal funding, and it's in peril. And that funding gap continues to grow. And as we all know, in the last year plus, our ability for federal funding has just become much more difficult, much more challenging. And the little bit of federal funding that we received has been threatened. And in some cases, it is gone. As a result of that, last year, OREF with the ORS and the Academy decided to take steps to begin to try to address that. And one of the things that we did in December is that we organized a research unity summit to bring specialty organizations, industry, and patient advocacy organizations together to begin to address how we can change this trajectory, this negative trajectory, in a more positive manner so that we can get more funding for MSK research, as well as bring greater awareness to MSK as a national health priority. We had the leadership of about 10 orthopedic specialty organizations at this summit. We had the leaders of NIAMS. We had 6 patient advocacy organizations and industry there. And it was a great meeting. The research objectives were to coordinate and amplify the research that's going on among all the different specialty organizations, to be able to identify what synergy, what resources can be combined so that we could do greater, more significant, more impactful research going forward, as well as to develop a unified plan for raising awareness about MSK issues in general. We came out of that with some objectives, one of which was to do a survey, which we're in the process of sending out, for organizations to let us know what their priorities are, what they've been funding, and where they see the gaps in their orthopedic specialty area. We're also asking the patient advocacy organizations as well as industry to supply us with the same information. And we're in the process now of forming a coalition that will do a national awareness campaign around MSK issues, again, to make it a national priority. Since December, we've reached out to all of these orthopedic societies and federal agencies, and the response has been extremely enthusiastic to be a part of this coalition. These are the publications that we've talked about, and there will be a joint statement coming out of a number of these organizations supporting the work of the coalition. And you can see the patient advocacy groups and coalitions, patient coalitions that are out there that are probably going to be part of this ongoing summit. These are the participants that were at the summit, and as I said, it was an excellent day. It was a very what we decided to do there was met enthusiastically. We came out with a statement saying very definitively that our nation's healthcare cannot be addressed until and unless MSK research becomes a national priority. So thank you for your attention. Thank you for supporting OREF, and please continue to support us. And lastly, I want to thank the residents for being here and for your time and energy in presenting today. And good luck. And hope all of you are winners today. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Lee. Do I need to advance the slide? Okay, no, okay, great. So listen, it's really my pleasure and honor to introduce Cecilia Pascual-Garrido, who is our keynote speaker. I think the one thing, as I introduce Cecilia, tell you a little bit about her, is the investment that she has made in her career, the time and energy involved in training to become an exceptional clinician, an extraordinary scientist, and you'll see the scientific part today. Cecilia joined the Department of Orthopedics in 2016, and she's a very accomplished clinician scientist, great educator. She did her medical degree at René Favaloro Medical University in Buenos Aires, then completed an orthopedic residency program at Hospital Italiano in Buenos Aires, Argentina. She also did a PhD from the University Católica in Argentina as well. So tremendous training in Argentina, but she came to the United States and worked with Susan Chubinskaya, outstanding investigator in arthritis, and Brian Cole, clinician scientist at Rush University, and did a research fellowship, I think maybe a 2-year research fellowship with them. And then she got 3 clinical fellowships, 2 in sports medicines, one in Lake Tahoe, the other at the Hospital for Special Surgery, and then a fellowship in adult reconstructive surgery at the University of Colorado. Initially, when Cecilia came here, she was a faculty member at the University of Colorado, and decided to move to St. Louis to pursue her academic career. Her work is dedicated solely to hip pathology, where she is an extraordinary expert in adolescent hip disease and that range of disease. And again, this mirrors her treatment of patients, but also her research interests in early FII to late arthritis in the cellular and molecular signals that are involved in that process. So she's fashioned her academic career to mirror, her research career to mirror her clinical activities. Her work focuses on the molecular mechanisms involved in pathogenesis of osteoarthritis and around DNA methylation, how injury to joint tissues in the hip through FAI can lead to alterations of DNA methylation, then altered signaling pathways, including PPAR gamma, which is modulated by DMT3A, I believe. So we'll hear more about that. The laboratory has received over $1.5 million in funding. She had numerous OREF grants. She leveraged that into an NHK08 award, an NIH R21 award. And right now, I think we're poised to hear very soon because she has a successful score about an NHR1 award, which I think is going to be worth about $4 million. So really excited about that. As a recognized leader in the field of hip preservation, she's won numerous awards. In the Department of Orthopedics here, she's won a Lee T. Ford Award for academic achievement. She received the William Harris Career Development Award from the Anchor Group, which looks at adolescent hip disease. She's won the AOSSM Cobb Memorial Award. And later this month here, she's going to receive a Dean's Impact Award at Washington University. So really distinguished. But I think one of the things that we're really excited about is to win a Hip Society Award is a big deal. She's won twice already the Otto Frank Award from the Hip Society for her contributions to the field. So you can see the recognition that Dr. Pascual Garrido has received. I can tell you, I work very closely with her. It's through an enormous amount of effort. And so very proud to have her be our keynote speaker today. Cecilia, turn it over to you. Thank you.
Wow, that was a lot. Thank you, Dr. Giff. It's an honor to be here. So I changed a little bit the title of my talk because I think you guys will enjoy a little bit about this. So before starting the talk, raise your hand who is thinking about doing a clinician scientist or academic pathway. Well, pretty good, very good. Normally, it's not that many, so this is great. So we'll talk a little bit about the path of becoming a clinician scientist, the reward, the risk, and the reality. So these are my disclosures. As you see here, significantly amount of my funding came from OREF. So thank you, Lee, for always being trying to help out with getting more money for the foundation, because I do think like it's critical for us, especially during your early stage of career, to have such a good foundation that can support your creativity and your research and your ideas. So after starting my career as a clinician scientist, maybe 20 years ago, I sometimes reflect and ask myself if I will do this again. And the answer is yes, absolutely, because I'm very passionate about it, but it's not without hesitation. I do feel like the reward is real, but so is the cost of becoming a clinician scientist. One of the things that I always try to teach my mentees is that whatever you are doing today with patient care and surgeries and technology, you have to think like all that came because the science of today is the technology of tomorrow. So whatever you are seeing and doing in the OR, although you're not thinking about it, many years ago, 20, 30 years ago, people were in the bench trying to understand and think about how to improve the quality of our patients and care. And I'll show you today a couple of examples of that. So for me, becoming a clinician scientist was kind of a mandate. I saw through my experience and my mentors that breakthrough advances in medicine almost uniformly result from the translational of new basic scientific knowledge into clinical practice, rather than from assessment, modification, or refinement of current methods of diagnosis and treatment. And I'll show you now a couple of examples. So for me, one of the most innovative orthopedic surgeons in the field has been John Charnley. Also, I may be biased because I'm a recon surgeon. But I think he has a clear example of the impact of a clinician scientist. His creativity, persistent resiliency, and insightful activities were dominant contributions to the entire field of orthopedics. It's not only hip and knee. So he was the first to bring the concept of low friction arthroplasty. So he believed that if we could develop a low friction arthroplasty, this would be a great idea for our patients and it will be durable. So he came with a concept. Initially, he tried to look to different plastics, and he basically came with the idea of using Teflons because this has a very low coefficient of friction and small femoral heads to replace the hips. So unfortunately, when he started doing this, he started putting in several patients, and this was a disaster. So although the Teflon has a very low friction, it's really very low resistant to wear. And then these patients came back. The patients did well like they normally do with arthroplasty, and then 2 years later, you can see a disaster, and that kind of simulates what happened with the metal on metal, correct? These patients were doing great, and you just need to wait a couple of years. So he operated, and then 2 years later, their patients started to have all these big problems. So at that time, imagine there was no internet. He was in England. You can read all this in his book, but basically, a lot of surgeons were flying to England and Manchester and trying to understand the technology. So he was very popular. So imagine in his brain, now he has to communicate to everybody that he has taught like this was a very bad idea. So he actually sent a letter written by him to the Academy, American Academy, trying to communicate to the Americans that basically he literally said this: the cart has been put before the horse, the artificial joint has been made and used. Now we are trying to find out how and why it fails. So imagine doing that, correct? Like going back and saying, I really did a very big mistake. But interesting, what he did was he went back to the lab and he spent basically 2 years more trying to find the best plastic. And he came with the idea of using polyethylene. So his work on the bench allowed him to develop the procedure of the century and improve millions and millions and keep improving the life of millions of people. So it became, of course, the procedure of the century. But if you think about it, it actually affected the whole field, because today we are using polyethylene not only in hip and knee, but we use it also in ankles, in elbows, etc., in shoulders. So think about today, like although he has passed, the impact is still alive. So now we are doing around 2 million arthroplasties of hip and knee in the year, and we expect that this will continue. And this will not be possible if we wouldn't have had John Charnley suggesting using polyethylene for reconstruction. The other incredible clinician scientist in America was William Harris, and Lee talked a little bit about him. He did a lot of work. He has a book also, it's called The Vanishing Bone. It's an amazing book about how he started studying about osteolysis. So again, the importance of being a clinician scientist is like you see the problems in your patients, and then you bring it back to the bench, and then you bring it back to care. So William Harris basically started seeing that these patients were having osteolysis after we were putting, at that time, we were all cemented hips. So he observed that there was like what he would call the vanishing bone, which was the osteolysis. And at that time, they thought that was basically the cement that was producing this osteolysis. Today we know it is the polyethylene. But he basically did not think like that was really the big problem. So he spent time in the lab. He started to see the macrophages, like phagocytizing these particles. And then he came to the idea is that like, okay, if the cement is a problem, why we don't start doing cementless hips? And he basically developed with Jorge Galante, who is actually also from Argentina, and he funded my rotation when I went to Rush. They created the first cementless total hip in arthroplasty, which was tremendous also for the care, correct? So it was a revolutionary concept with tremendous impact in primary and revision arthroplasty. So these are clear examples of how clinician science can impact the field. And you have the opportunity of impact not only the patients that you treat, but everything you leave behind. So it's millions and millions and millions of patients. So this is the power of doing something that will impact the field. So today, we use cementless hip for almost all of our procedures. We are probably cementing less than 5%. And we do complex cases with cementless hip replacements. So how was my path to become a clinician scientist? I'm originally from Buenos Aires, Argentina, and I did my residency in Hospital Italiano. And I was very fortunate to have a clinician scientist as my mentor. He was the chair of the department. And he always believed, I was a resident, and he always believed that doing science was very important because he thought it was the only way to give back to the field. So he stimulated us. There you see us. That was my first American Academy in that picture, maybe 30 years ago. And the person with the green polar is Enekin. So my mentor, Luis Musculo, is actually musculoskeletal oncology. And he basically had a tremendous impact in South America. He built the biggest center of sarcomas in El Hospital Italiano. And basically what he did is he came with the idea of using osteoarticular allografts for the treatment of osteosarcomas in the knee. And at that time, that was very controversial, correct? Because we didn't know the response, immune response when you will do a transplant. So he basically came to Chicago. He studied many years, basically in mice models, allografts, and trying to understand. I basically came and showing like when you do these transplants, there's no rejection. It's basically like a low chronic inflammatory response. But this, at least in the animal model, they did very well. So then he went back to Argentina and he developed the biggest center of osteosarcomas and sarcomas in South America. And today, many patients from around the world, and especially from South America, will go to Buenos Aires, to our center, to have these reconstructive procedures. When I finished my residency, I was spent some time at Rush. My mentors were incredible to me. I spent time basically in the biochemistry department. I did a research fellow there with Susan Chubiscaya, who was past president of OREF. And she was an incredible mentor to me. And then I did clinical research with Brian Cole, who is now the chair of orthopedics at Rush. So this, as you see, I was always very, I had like always a good opportunity to be surrounded by incredible people and mentors. And there I actually learned how to do, perform really critical experiments and stimulate me to continue the path of becoming a clinician scientist. I then also did a fellowship at HSS, and Scott Rodio was also mentioned today too by Lee. So I worked together with Scott Rodio. So although I was a clinical fellow and I was very busy clinically, I was always able to collaborate with people, with scientists, clinician scientists. So I was very engaged always in trying to continue my research career. And then when I joined the University of Colorado for 2 years, I also was collaborating with incredible scientists. Stephanie Bryan worked a lot on hydrogels, and then Lori Goodrich is actually also a clinician scientist. She's a vet, but she's also a clinician scientist. So I was always, as you see, trying to continue my research, although I was busy clinically. And then in 2016, I joined WashU. I was recruited by Dr. O'Keefe and Dr. Cloisi. And this, I think, it was key in my career because I started to be surrounded by true clinician scientists and experts in the field, talented young people that I think like that makes you become very successful. So this place is very special when you want to do a clinician scientist path. And then also, it's very important not only having good mentors, but also having very talented young people, because those are the people that are going to help you push, your research and your ideas forward. So if you're a clinician scientist, you will have basically 2 full-time jobs in one career. And basically, it's a busy kind of life, but if you are passionate about it, I think it's very rewarding. So I basically live in between these two worlds. So I live in a world where the reconsurgence, like if you go to ACAS, it's all about how many cases you have done and who does the most cases in a year. So I call it the King Kong syndrome, which is basically you are visible, immediate recognition, you are King Kong, correct? You love it. And then on the other side, you have the clinician scientist, where they are highly intelligent. We have Matt Silva here, so clear example. They work very quietly, their work is unseen, and you are constantly adapting and multitasking. So this is kind of the life I normally live in between. So as a clinician, you will have immediate impact. So you will do a surgeries, your patients will love you at 6 weeks. They come to your clinic, they love you, their new hip, you change their life. It's financially rewarded because of course, you get more money or more reward when you do surgeries. It's predictable, correct? Like when we do surgery in arthroplasty, 98% of our patients will do well. Versus science, I would say like 80% of the chances you are not going to get funded. So as a clinician, you're going to work with young, talented surgeons, which is also very stimulating with the residents and the fellows. And as I say, it's very visual. You're in the OR, you're at the center of attention. Everybody wants your input. Everybody needs you. You tell everybody what to do. And you come out and you did it and you show the x-ray and you love it. And that's the way it is as a clinician. And these are clear examples of how we impact the patients that we treat with as a clinician. So for example, this case, a woman that came to my clinic with a PGI, chronic PGI, we did a spacer, and then basically she had huge acetabular defects, so we ended up doing a 3D triflant custom implant, and this is the case when we do the case, and we actually did the implant, and then we cemented a dual mobility cap, and the patient 1 year later, she's doing great, she loves it, you change the life of this person. This is another case of mine, just showing you, the immediate impact that you have when you do surgery. Another patient of mine, young girl, 35 years old with left hip PTOA, horrible story, drug addict, had a baby, 3-month-old baby. So we have to condition her for her surgery. She did her job. And then we did, with a robot, the total hip replacement, and she loves it. And she now is enjoying her baby. She's not anymore on drugs. She's going back to work. You change the life of people that you treat. So what's the other part of the scientist? Your impact is going to be delayed. It's not going to be like the cases I show you. And when you get your R01, it's not just the moment you get the R01, it's the result of all the unseen work that I've had for many, many years. It's very uncertain. Submission, normally when you submit an NIH, you will not know about it for around a year, but you still need to pay your employees and the lab expenses, so that generates a lot of stress. It's very unpredictable, like I said. Most of the time, the experiments don't work. Your postdoc calls you because he's not able to do the experiment, so we need to see and talk with some other people, so it's not a surgery. And then it's unseen, correct? Like nobody sees all the work you do behind the scenes with the lab, with your postdocs, with the grants, etc. And then you have to think like the impact will be long-term. It's not going to be immediate impact. And now, basically, I'll show you a little bit of what we do in the lab. So my work basically is focused on understanding the mediators of osteoarthritis in the pre-arthritic hip. So because I'm able to treat patients with pre-OA and advanced OA, when I came here, we started taking cartilage samples from these patients, and then we started analyzing it in the lab. Very straightforward, simple kind of experiments when I began. And basically what we saw was like at the zone of impingement in the cartilage area, if you will see that cartilage that looks normal when you are doing the surgery, if you look at it in the microscope, it's actually a very obstructed phenotype. So we started to see like really those patients with impingement, at the zone of impingement, there was an osteoarthritic phenotype, and also the amount of inflammation that patients will have at the zone of impingement was as bad as those patients with advanced arthritis. So then we tried to get a little bit more information on this. So we used kind of similar cohort with patients with pre-OA and patients with advanced arthritis. And then we perform RNA sequence to try to understand a little bit more the pathways in this disease. And we were able to show for the first time, like during early and late state of disease, these are two clear clusters like you see here. Each row is a gene and each column is a patient. And you can see like the genes that are downregulated, like you can see in blue in early FAI, are upregulated in late FAI. And this was an interesting concept because a lot of the research that was coming from osteoarthritis, for osteoarthritis, was basically from advanced hip disease. But there was no real information about the early stages of disease. And I think this is the critical part because during early stages of disease, is when you are probably able to change the disease. And then we did protein interaction analysis, which allows you to identify hub genes. So these is like the hub airports. These are genes that are very important in the progression of osteoarthritis. And we found the PPR gamma, and interesting what we saw was that the PPR gamma is expressing the nucleus of the chondrocytes, and it has very good expression when you don't have disease. But as you start getting osteoarthritis, you kind of lose expression of the PPR gamma. And then we were also able to describe the expression of PPR gamma, not only in the articular cartilage, but the PPR gamma is also expressed in the synovium, in the pulvinar area, and in the labrum. And this is very important because if you think about doing a therapy in the future, you are going to affect all the soft tissue, not just only the cartilage. And then one of the questions that we wanted to ask was, why is PPR gamma important in the joint? And we show that it has a very good role in cartilage autophagy. So cartilage autophagy is very popular in osteoarthritis. As you become with more osteoarthritis, you start to lose the autophagy. And it seems like PPR gamma is able to restore the autophagy in the cartilage. So then basically, we knew that we were losing expression, but one of the questions that we had in the lab is why we are losing expression of PPR gamma. And basically, we saw in the lab that there's inflammation at the zone of impingement, and inflammation plays a critical role in epigenetic changes. And I collaborate a lot with Dr. O'Keefe, who is a pioneer in epigenetics. And we thought about trying to see if these molecules that are critical in epigenetic changes are really driving the suppression of PPR gamma. So we started looking into different DMTs, that stands for DNA methylation transfers, and we were able to prove that the one that methylates the CPG area is basically the 3A. So what happens is you have inflammation, there increase of these molecules, one of them is the 3A, and then the 3A hypermethylates the PPR gamma CPG area, and then you lose expression of PPR gamma. And once you lose the expression of PPR gamma, then you start with cartilage autophagy dysregulation. We are working also on macrophage polarization and mitochondrial function. So there's a lot of things that happens when you lose the expression of PPR gamma. So the next thing we wanted to do is we showed that DMT3A binds into this CPG area, but we haven't proved functionality, correct? Like you can bind, but that doesn't mean anything. So then we did our other experiment that was our second Hip Society award. So we did models in the lab with gain on function and loss of function of DMT3A. And basically we were able to prove this functionality where if you suppress DMT3A, PPR gamma starts to restore and you kind of starts to express again PPR gamma. And then when PPR gamma is expressed, you improve collagen 2, you reduce MMP13, and we also here you can see with the Western blot in a protein level. So it's a key pathway that we proved that we were able to regulate in the lab and that we could probably use in the future to manipulate this with our patients. And then the other thing that we have doing in the last 3 years is, 2 years I will say, trying to understand pain in the pre-arthritic hip. So Pain is now very popular also to study because this is why our patients come to our clinic. And there's basically what is called the NDF-TRICA signaling, which has been pretty established in osteoarthritis as a mechanism of pain. So when NDF is expressed, it binds to TRICA, and then you have peripheral and central sensitization, and then the patient feels pain. But there has not been actually very studies if this is really the mechanisms that is driving pain in our patients with pre-OA. So if you see here, two different patients, correct? The first patient has advanced arthritis with subluxation of the hip. This patient, you assume, will be in a lot of pain. Second patients, I don't see that much deformity, typical FAI, a little bit pincer. So in the first case, we ended up doing a replacement of the hip. In the second case, we ended up doing a labrum reconstruction. But if you ask these patients how much pain they both have the similar severe amount of pain. But if you think about it, the mechanisms with these patients are generating pain, it should be different, correct? And the pain is normally driven by synovium, correct? So if you see those synoviums from those two patients, the patients with advanced arthritis have a very inflammatory synovium with a lot of lymphocytes, etc. The second patient doesn't have even synovitis. So you can see like this is probably not, they are not sharing the same mechanism. So we did a study basically analyzing the synovium in these two patient state of disease. And you can see like the amount of inflammation is totally different, but clinically these two patients are having the same amount of pain. So what we did was, okay, let's see if NDF-TRICA is actually important at the two stages of disease. And what we found was that NDF-TRICA is highly expressed in the synovium of patients with osteoarthritis, but there's no expression in the patients with FAI. So basically, it seems like the NDF-TRICA does not seem to be a mediator in pain in the pre-arthritic hip. So what are the mediators of these patients? So I read this paper where I thought it was important, and I always think like it's very important to read papers because that's where you are going to create your ideas. So it's something you guys have to have the habit of doing it. But in this study, what they did is they took patients with RA, and in RA, there seems to be the same. There are patients that have an inflammatory phenotype and patients with they call it non-inflammatory. So basically, if you will have the patients with inflammation, the amount of inflammation that you see in the histology correlates with the score pain, the pain score. But in those patients that do not have inflammation, there's no correlation. So what these guys did was basically identify pain-associated genes that are not related to inflammation. And then they put them all together and then they correlated with the clinical scores. And they definitely found a strict correlation between these pain-associated genes that are non-inflammatory with clinical scores. And they even did single-cell sequencing, identifying what cell is producing these molecules, which is a type of fibroblasts that you can find in the synovium. So we kind of said, okay, let's do something similar. Let's go through these non-inflammatory pain-associated genes and try to see in the patients with FAI, I kind of expressing these genes compared to the advanced arthritis. And we definitely find some of them that seems to be playing a critical role in pain, and it's not actually, you don't see them in advanced arthritis. So it's very interesting because we are treating pain in these two patients' population with the same way, and probably we should not be treating by the same type of drugs because the FAI is non-inflammatory in the synovium. So the next goal is we are trying to define pain mechanisms in high-risk pre-arthritic patients using a multimodal translational approach. And we are working with Alex Knight that Dr. O'Keefe recruited him like 2 years ago, and he's fantastic, young, talented, also scientist. And basically, he has a way where we try to isolate the nucleus of the cell. So we were able to show this. And basically what we do is we get the synovium from the OR, we freeze them, and then basically you clear all the debris, and then you have a very nice, pure, intact nucleus that you're going to use for single-cell sequencing. And this is very good because we are going to understand better the pathways, the cells that are expressing this, which is also important. And then what we are going to do, and we started doing a little bit, and this also, Dr. O'Keefe has done a lot of the DRG isolation for pain. So basically, you can isolate the cells from the dorsal root ganglion, and then you can stimulate these cells. It's called sprouting. So the more these cells get stimulated, the more sprouting you'll see, and it correlates with clinical pain. So of course, we don't have human DRT tissue. So basically, we are using a cell line that you can get from Anna Bios, because we don't have human DRT tissue from our patients. And then the goal is to co-culture this with the fibroblast of our own patients. And then we can see when you produce more sprouting. So this is kind of modelings of pain that we are working on. And then the other thing I have done in the lab is basically develop a model of FAI, which I think is very important, because all the translational things that you find in the lab, you have to have a platform, correct, to test this. So we developed this model, which is pretty consistent right now. So you injure the faces of the immature rabbits, and then you basically do a scar there, and then they develop this deformity that is very similar to what we see in FAI-CAM, and then these animals end up developing arthritis at 3 months. So this platform is used for us right now to develop arthritis, and then we are trying nanoparticles with silenced RNA DMT3A and see if the joint gets much better after silencing the DMT3A. So the reality of the timeline is I joined WashU in 2016. I was really very well funded from OREF early on. Then I got a KO8, but then all those 4 years, I also had several funds from REF. So again, the importance of this foundation for us. And then I got an R21 last year, and it seems like this year I'll get the R01. So it has been years of work, failures, and persistence. So that was when I was young on the left side, and then now a more 10 years later with one of my friends who is also came from Italiano just to visit me here. So the reality is that clinic and OR always wins in the short term. Science requires deep, uninterrupted time. The grants will always be a constant background of stress, because you never know when you're going to get funded. And understand that the rejection is the norm, it's not the exception. Then you're going to be living in this dual world with these RVU-based systems. So there's a high push to produce high volume, versus a protected time where you can basically think about, get ideas, spend time with your lab members, etc. You are definitely going to be valued for both, but compensated more for one. And I think you will constantly live in this tension between clinical volume and academic output. So the risk is, I do think like we have a high risk for burnout. So we try to be good at both things. Another thing that is important for you guys to understand is like doing translational science does not mean you love operating any less. Sometimes we get a little bit of bias saying, oh, they're probably doing more science because they don't want to operate that much, but that's actually not true. We love operating. And I think we don't fully belong to one of the two worlds, but I basically bridge both worlds. So you can see me there. I have part of my life in the OR and then part of my life in the lab. So moving forward, I think you need to be committed to advance your specialty, and this can be by different ways. It's not only by science. You can commit being a good educator, a good surgeon, to give back to a community, etc. It's very important that you develop good habits. Repetition is the mother of skill. You will have high and lows, but remember, if you just keep good habits, you're going to get there. Very important to find and pursue your passions and never lose enthusiasm. It's easy to be very excited when you are young and you have a lot of things ahead, but as you get older, it's hard to keep that up. So I think that's one of the reasons I like to be surrounded by young surgeons like you, because it keeps my enthusiasm up. And the most important is to know that advances are still ahead. Thank you very much.
So we have time for some questions. Yes, so we're gonna get the microphone up there so that because this is on video and they'll be able to hear the questions. So this is from Dr. Boyer.
Dr. Dr. Pascual Garrido, thank you for your wonderful talk. You and I have known each other for 10 years now. My question to you is a little preface. I remember at the beginning of my medical school education 40 years ago that the GI reflux disease was caused by stress. And stomach ulcers are now known to be caused by H. pylori, which was a bizarre thought even at the time and is now. My question to you is, with that kind of in the background, are there things that are being thought of now in hip arthritis in terms of the etiology of the disease and the pathoetiology and the signaling that you've described and that you're investigating that are akin in a crazy way to H. pylori being an idea that causes stomach ulcers?
Yes, Margie. So I think like the same like you, like when I studied arthritis back in the day, we all thought like arthritis was an inflammatory disease. And today I think it's way more than that. And normally it's not an inflammatory disease. Like you can see in my synovium studies, there's definitely some inflammation, but we always thought like arthritis is purely inflammatory. And from all my studies, I think like it's not that like that, correct? Like arthritis is more a disease where you can see epigenetic changes and there's cartilage autophagy dysregulation, mitochondrial dysfunction. But when I was young, I also learned like arthritis is purely inflammatory, and I think like that's not right. I think like that would be one of the things that changed from me. Yeah, and then with the new technology, we certainly study way more, like I was saying, like now we are studying a lot mitochondrial function. I never thought about mitochondrial function when I was 20 years ago. So I think like that will be one of the things I will say change.
For those of you who are here, Dr. Boyer was also really contributed to the field. He's a past president of the Hand Society. He's currently a director of the American Board of Orthopedic Surgery, and he leads the written exam. So he's quickly getting the questions together that you're going to take soon. So be nice to Dr. Boyer. He'll write some easy questions. Dr. Leem, our program director, I think maybe has a question.
Yeah, excellent talk, and I think I understood 6 words of what you said in the science. So I'm glad there's smarter people. No, it's. I think one of the things, I know a small percentage of people in this room are going to go on clinician scientists, but I think the biggest thing that you sort of hit home with me is sort of not chasing the immediate sort of fame, right? And I think that's something that I see a lot of young surgeons run into when they get into their practice. They want to get super busy. They want to do 18,000 reviews. They want to do 1 million cases. And yet, like you said, that's the short term. But you think about this over a 30-year career and how you want to change the field and how you want to have the impact. And this kind of work is incredible. What would be your biggest sort of take home for the younger residents as they're looking at their pathway here in terms of how to make sure they're balancing that, not just looking for that short-term immediate impact? Because I see that a lot, and I see that burnout, and then I see a lot of frustration in young surgeons where they maybe don't think that this is really what they thought this job was about. And then as someone who's now 10 years in with you, you kind of get through the clinical stuff and it becomes not boring, but it becomes, more routine. And then there's that extra that you want to have, and placing those pathways that you've seen that now you're getting the rewards of putting all that work in the last 10 years and being able to see that growth is incredible. But that took work from the beginning and recognition from the beginning, where a lot of us, I think, immediately just look at the clinical side, but not at the other aspects of this job that we're doing, and we kind of lose sight of that.
Yeah, Alex, that's a great point, and I do see that. I think like is the way the world is correct right now, like the visibility, and people are eager, when you get into your practice to show like you can do this amount of cases. And I agree with you. I think like once you get through all that learning curve, it becomes a little bit routine. So for me, and I always tell the residents, like the clinician scientist will give you the opportunity to keep stimulating that intellectual and creativity aspect that we all have. And sometimes we lose because especially the way now medicine is. So for example, think about a recon surgeon, correct? We all have protocols. We all do systematically the same thing every time. So that's great, but it also takes you away from the creativity and ideas. So I think like constantly making sure you are, and you don't need to become a scientist, but as I said, like, read papers, stimulate your brain, go to meetings, make sure like you are not only becoming an excellent surgeon, that you should be an excellent surgeon, but you are also stimulating that part of the brain, and we just don't become this surgeon which is just following protocols and doing one over and over and over the same thing. For me, I love operating, but for me, the things that keeps my brain sharp is all this that also interacting with the young surgeons. I love interacting with them, but I think also the scientific part is what keeps my ideas and, we should do this. I don't never feel like that in the OR. I think like it's a different type of work, but I agree. Your value is not by the 800 cases you did in a year, is way more than that.
Dr. Boyer. again.
Sorry, a follow-up question, Dr. Pascual Garrido. Dr. O'Keefe works out every morning. Dr. Brogan in the front row runs marathons. You run marathons. It seems to me that to function at the level that you all function in terms of creativity and research, there has to be a physical outlet for some of the energy. How important is that to you?
Very important. Yeah.
I know it is to you. Dr. O'Keefe and Dr. Brogan perhaps might comment.
Well, I think, Marty, I am a 365-day-a-year guy. So I was up at 4 this morning working out. So that's really my routine, and sort of gets my mind set for the day, which I think is important. I certainly cannot run a marathon, though. So I tip my hat to David and Cecilia. David, any comments?
I think whatever it is that that keeps you sane is important, and you have to have some time for yourself, and that's the most selfish part of my day, is to run. I think also the discipline that it requires for me to train at early in the morning when nobody else is up and about is also the same discipline that helps with doing a lot of the research too. So it's complementary.
David Clever is a clinician scientist who joined us. David has this distinction of being the only person in the department who has first authored a paper at Cell, which is really a distinction.
Long time ago.
Yeah, but David is an immunologist, MD, PhD on oncology. David.
Hey, Dr. Pascual Garrido, good to see you. I was wondering if you could comment a little bit for everybody's here and then myself as well, just starting back in 2016, the early end of your timeline in your surgeon scientist journey. I think one of the things that I'm learning is that your clinical practice is far more than the time that you're in surgery and the time that you're in clinic, especially in the era of all the ways in which we can be communicated with and emails and epic messages and all that kind of stuff. And it's very, that stuff enters your academic time or your creative time without any firewall. And so I'm curious, what are some of the tangible things that you do to really kind of protect not just your time, but yourself and your mindset when you are going more into that research mode, and then maybe how that's changed over the last 10 years, because I think, for all of us, in anything that we do, you're going to get more efficient with it. And so maybe how did your academic time as an very, very early career surgeon scientist change from kind of how you use your academic time now?
Yeah, David, that's a great question. So at the beginning, I have to say I had more time for research because my clinic was not so busy. So I definitely think like if you are starting a academic pathway, the first years you'll probably have a little bit more time to organize your lab and spend more time. Right now, my clinic is extremely busy, but I have been able to create incredible teams. So I think like it's key to have excellent clinical support. So my clinical team is amazing. It took me 10 years. And I'm, of course, way more efficient in the OR, correct? Like I can do way more cases than I was able to do maybe 10 years ago. And then I'm very focused. So I normally don't distract myself too much. So if I like, let's say like this afternoon, I will be working on my grants, or I have the capacity of staying focused in whatever I'm doing. So if I'm in the OR, I'm very focused in the OR. If I'm with research, I'm very focused with that. And I think that's very important, especially in the world we live right now. So I don't do social media. I basically don't get distractions. Like I have my phone on silence. So, emails, I don't have the alarm of the email coming in, because that drives me crazy. So I learned to take away the noises. And I think like that's important. Right now it's hard, correct? But it is, yeah. And the team, I mean, I don't have too many people in my lab, but they are both amazing, and I'm constantly interacting with them. I'm involved. I talk to them every time in the phone every day. I WhatsApp, like they are part of my family. So I think like you have to show availability for them, and they will respond to you.
Okay, so I think I would just, as we finish up, I just emphasize a couple things. One is really characteristic, I think, to take home is if you want to be a clinician scientist, become a really good clinician, because you never take the time out to do the science and feel comfortable doing that, because patient care is so important. The other thing is, Cecilia, you've used mentors. I mean, really appreciate your talk, because it shows that every step along the way, mentors and colleagues, and even as you get to my age, you still have mentors. You still have people that you seek advice from. So always, I think, in your career, look for those people who can help you find a path forward and help you to get better at what you want to accomplish. So let's have a round of applause. Really extraordinary, Cecilia. So we had a couple folks who couldn't make it, so we're not really behind. We'll be able to catch up along the way, but we're going to have our first session now, and so first session moderators will come on down. I think we have one of our faculty paired with one of our residents, though, will introduce themselves as they come forward.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you. I'm Alexander Lean, for those of y'all that don't know me. I'm a shoulder and elbow surgeon, and
I'm Kate Jarrell. I'm one of the PGY5 residents going into hand surgery at the University of Washington next year.
excellent. So we're going to start out this first case. Just as a reminder for the speakers, y'all have 4 minutes. We're going to try to keep somewhat on time. It's good practice to keep within the time limits when you're presenting. So Maggie is going to signal you when you have 1 minute left, and then we won't like pull you off stage, but we might gently remind you at 4 minutes to keep going. So we'll let everyone finish, and then we'll have time for question and answers after everyone's done in the first presentation here. So I'd like to bring the first speaker down, Dr. Sean Clark from the Mayo Clinic, talking about elbow arthrodesis continues to be associated with poor outcomes and a high reoperation rate.
I'd like to thank my co-authors and OREF for allowing me to present this talk. Our disclosures can be found on the Academy's website. Destruction of the elbow through severe trauma can be a very challenging problem to treat, especially in younger patients. Total elbow arthroplasty is often considered. However, surgeons are wary due to their high complication and revision rates. An alternative approach to arthroplasty is elbow arthrodesis or elbow fusion. However, this is a rarely performed procedure with prior literature consisting of very small case series and case reports. Thus, the purpose of this study was to examine the outcomes of elbow arthrodesis and to determine if this is a worthwhile salvage procedure for elbows not amenable to surgical reconstruction or arthroplasty. In this study, a total of 13 patients or 13 elbows were included with a mean age of 40 years old. All but one of these patients underwent elbow arthrodesis after severe trauma, with the other patient undergoing arthrodesis after failed arthroplasty. The mean follow-up for this study was 6 years, and the mean arthrodesis angle was 104 degrees. When looking at the outcomes of this study, all patients reported functional limitations with their elbow after arthrodesis. The mean VAS score was 2 out of 10, demonstrating reasonable pain relief. The mean Mayo elbow performance score is 53 out of 100, demonstrating poor functional outcomes at final follow-up. The mean SANE score was 36 out of 100. On a scale from 0 to 10, with 10 being the most satisfied, the mean satisfaction score was an 8. And 60% of patients reported that their elbow was much better or slightly better after surgery. When looking at the complications, the complication rate was extremely high, at nearly 50%, with half of these being non-union and the other half being fractures around the arthrodesis plate. All of these complications underwent subsequent revision surgery, except for one of the periprosthetic fractures that healed with non-operative management. In conclusion, elbow arthrodesis demonstrated reasonable pain relief and patient satisfaction despite poor functional outcomes at a mean 6-year follow-up. The complication rate was substantial at nearly 50%, and as a result, efforts should be made to optimize total elbow arthroplasty in younger patients who sustain severe elbow trauma so that arthrodesis can be avoided. Thank you.
All right, our next speaker is Joseph Lazara from SLU University. He will be discussing assessing the usefulness of diagnostic shoulder arthroscopy in evaluating painful shoulder replacement.
Hello, everyone. My name is JT Lazara, and I'm from St. Louis University Hospital, just down the road. And today, I'm going to be presenting my research under the direction of Dr. Randall Otto. And we are presenting our findings for a diagnostic stepwise algorithm that includes diagnostic arthroscopy for patients specifically that present with pain after shoulder arthroplasty. Here we go. Nice. So this is a difficult problem. Patients who present in clinic with painful shoulder arthroplasty, imagings also are often negative. Aspirations often yield a small volume that's not enough for culture or low virulence organisms such as C. acnes. And oftentimes those aspirations are dry taps. Further, patients also have a concaminant dual pathology, so they have mechanical problems as well as infectious problems. And it's really hard to wean out which exactly is kind of the problem and what kind of management should be in general. So we came up with this algorithm. Essentially, it's for patients strictly who come in with painful shoulder arthroplasty, who undergo that standard workup of X-ray, CT, inflammatory labs, and aspiration. And ultimately, it leads to an equivocal result. So where do you go from there? The main points of our algorithm really are that we perform a lidocaine challenge with an intra-articular injection in the glenohumeral joint with a small volume of lidocaine to really determine if the patient's etiology of their pain is intra-articular. If that challenge is positive, they move on to diagnostic arthroscopy. So for our case series, our retrospective case series, we had 29 patients, 25 of those being reverses, 4 being anatomic total shoulder replacements, and all, like I showed in the diagram previous, had that equivocal workup kind of diagnostically saying, where do we go from here? They all underwent shoulder arthroscopy, and the results essentially showed that about 52% of them had mechanical pathology, 17 infectious pathology, and of that 17%, actually the vast majority of them also had concomitant mechanical pathology. Finally, 41% had no pathology at all. So I think this is really important breaking down some of our results. Of the mechanical pathology, more than 50%, the vast majority was made up from polyethylene wear as well as intra-articular impingement. I think there's a couple different things to note too, like bony resorption is something that we saw in arthroscopy, but that we weren't actually able to see that bony resorption on, for example, a CT scan. So how does this actually affect our management? I think this is really important because not only did the positive results show us some sort of infectious etiology or mechanical etiology, but those negative results really showed that continued non-operative management, physical therapy, was the treatment that was necessary for these patients, and really kind of solidified that not operating and not performing some sort of revision surgery was kind of the right thing to be doing. We had revision surgery 45%, as you can see here, and 55% undergoing non-operative management. So I think those big takeaways are that our arthroscopy can be an extremely diagnostic tool with tissue sampling that we performed while performing arthroscopy to actually tease out between those infectious and mechanical etiologies, or possibility of the dual pathology that's going on for patients, and really help justify whether or not their course should be some sort of suppressive antibiotics or whether they should undergo some sort of revision surgery. Further, I think the negative results of arthroscopy are really important, that continued non-operative management is the right direction to be pursuing. And I think arthroscopy really fits in general into this final stepwise diagnostic algorithm that I presented to help us understand what do we do in a patient who has an equivocal workup, and how do we find the etiology of the pain from their shoulder. Lastly, I'd just like to say thank you to my co-authors, Ben and Aaron, of course, Dr. Otto, who without whom his surgeries, this research would not be possible, and our research coordinators, Allison and Vinny, for all their help and direction. Thank you, guys.
All right. Thank you very much. If we get the rest of the speakers to kind of make their way down, and then JT, grab a seat in the front row when you're done, because we'll have time for questions after that. Next up is Dr. Patel from University of Michigan, going over declining use of multiple preoperative corticosteroid injections prior to shoulder surgery and national trends analysis.
Good morning. I'm Nick Patel. I'd like to acknowledge my mentors, Dr. Abender and Dr. Whitney, for their guidance on this project. We have no disclosures. Corticosteroid injections remain a cornerstone of non-operative management in shoulder pathology. However, their role has become increasingly controversial, with concerns around infection, tendon degradation, and increased risk for revision surgery. This all culminates the commonly cited 3-month rule, where providers recommend waiting at least 3 months between subsequent injections or before proceeding to surgery. While the current literature is pretty clear on the timing of injections, we still don't have a clear answer into how many injections are too many. Thus, the purpose of this study was to identify trends over time to see if there is a change in the quantity of injections patients are receiving prior to surgery. We hypothesized that over the past decade, there's a decrease in the number of injections patients are receiving, specifically multiple injections prior to rotator cuff repair and shoulder arthroplasty. We performed a retrospective cohort study using 2 large databases. We used CPT codes to identify patients who underwent cuff repair or arthroplasty, and then tally the number of injections they received in the 2 years prior to surgery. In total, we had over 360,000 patients in the cuff repair group and over 120,000 patients in the arthroplasty group. Looking at our results, in the cuff repair group, we saw a clear inflection point around 2014, where prior to this, patients were actually increasing the number of injections they were receiving. But after this point, the percentage of patients receiving 0 injections prior to surgery increased by over 9%. At the same time, those receiving single or multiple injections decreased. Most notably, those receiving multiple injections decreased by almost 5%. We saw a similar pattern in the arthroplasty group, but even more prominent. Those percentage of those receiving 0 injections are increased by almost 11%, and those receiving multiple injections decreased by nearly 9%. Now, this shift may be justified. A study from 2019 by Weber et al. Looked at over 22,000 patients and found that patients receiving 2 or more injections were associated with a 2-fold increased risk of revision after rotator cuff repair. On the contrary, there's been smaller studies since there, including this one from Smith et al., who are concluding that preoperative steroid injections may not actually be impacting reoperation or patient-reported outcomes, thus bringing into question this concern around steroid injections and if this declining trend is truly justified. So what does this all mean? Since 2014, patients across the country have been decreasing the number of injections that they're receiving prior to surgery. More specifically, there's been a larger movement away from repeated steroid injections. This likely reflects growing awareness around the potential concerns and a possible shift towards earlier surgical intervention. Now, this is highlighted in our arthroplasty group, where previously patients and surgeons tried to maximize non-operative management, but now they may be more inclined to have a lower threshold to proceed to surgery. The key point is that either way, nationwide practices have already been changing before fully defining safe limits. Thus, defining a safe number of steroid injections prior to surgery is an important next step for us. It also may be beneficial to understand if earlier surgical intervention and this trend for fewer steroid injections is truly leading to less revision, less infection, and other complications. The field is already changing practice patterns. Now the priority is to identify an evidence-based threshold that justifies this change. Thank you.
Our next presenter will be Michael Sheet from Loyola University, presenting on reverse shoulder arthroplasty for proximal humerus fractures and reverse shoulder arthroplasty for elective indications should have separate CPT codes.
Alrighty, so the indications for reverse shoulder arthroplasty have been increasing over the years. Initially developed primarily for rotator cuff arthropathy, massive rotator cuff tears. It's really expanded out to glenohumeral arthritis, and particularly proximal humerus fractures. This recent study from JSES that analyzed different outcomes following OREF, hemiarthroplasty, or reversal arthroplasty for fractures, they found similar final range of motion postoperatively. While OREF had the highest rates of radiographic union, the lowest reoperation rates were noted within reversal arthroplasty, known to be nearly 10% less than the other modalities. However, there's only one singular CPT code that's available for shoulder arthroplasty in general, which may fail to reflect the surgical complexity, resource utilization, and patient medical burden that proximal humerus fractures express on these patients and the healthcare system. So the goal of our study was to assess the clinical and healthcare expenditure outcomes of reverse shoulder arthroplasty for elective indications versus indications for proximal humerus fracture. Ultimately, we hypothesized that proximal humerus fractures will result in longer operative times, higher complication rates, inferior clinical functional outcomes, and higher healthcare cost expenditures. So ultimately, this was a retrospective cohort from 2011 to 2020 that included 197 patients underwent reverse shoulder arthroplasty. We exclude patients that had prior ORIF, malunion or non-union, pathologic lesions or fractures, less than 1 year follow-up, and missing demographic, operative, outcome, and cost data. Ultimately, there's 28 fractures that were included in the study and 169 patients for elective indications that include arthritis and rotator cuff arthropathy. Ultimately, the overall demographics were similar between the two groups, albeit fracture group had slightly higher rates of mild liver disease. There's slightly higher rates of myocardial infarction preoperatively. The arthropathy group, otherwise no other significant comorbidity differences. Additionally, important to note that patient insurance was no significant difference between both of the groups. So ultimately, reverse shoulder arthroplasty for fracture resulted in higher lengths of stay, nearly 2 days longer than patients that had arthropathy. Operative times were nearly 30 minutes longer than the elective indications group. And additionally, more patients were ultimately discharged to skilled nursing facilities and inpatient rehab facilities for those that had fractures and compared to the elective indications. Additionally, in regards to cost data for the patients in the healthcare system, it was known that there's nearly $20,000 grade patient charges for patients that have proximal humerus fractures. And while not statistically significant, there's nearly $2,500 of greater hospital costs for proximal humerus fracture cases. Ultimately, no differences in revision rates were noted early or global follow-up. Additionally, important to note that the functional outcomes were less within patients with proximal humerus fractures, notably having less forward flexion at both 2 months and 6 months postoperatively, and less external rotation at 6 and 12 months postoperatively. This is comparable to data that's been recently presented in JSES, where they analyzed a meta-analysis of multiple studies regarding reverse shoulder arthroplasty for elective indications versus for fracture. They found patients with fractures had less active range of motion, lower constant scores, and worse tuberosity healing rates. And it's important to note that there's already separate CPT codes, particularly in our hip arthroplasty colleagues. They note that there's different separate CPT codes, particularly for elective hemiarthroplasty compared to fracture hemiarthroplasty. And where a recent study in Journal Arthroplasty noted that for hip arthroplasty for patients with fracture, we know that there's greater age and comorbidities, longer postoperative length of stay, and additionally greater costs in the 9-day global period for both the patient and the healthcare system. So ultimately, reverse for fractures in comparison to elective arthroplasty has worse postoperative range of motion, longer hospital length of stay, and greater costs to the healthcare system and the patient. Current separate CPT codes for hip hemiarthroplasty or fracture arthrosis are currently present, which do reflect the differences in the patient groups for both of these in both outcomes and also cost to the system. And separate CPT codes for the reverse for fracture may provide more accurate and transparent coding and billing, and appropriate appreciation for the increased technical complexity and resource utilization. And important limitations to note is that this was a retrospective study. There's lack of validated patient-reported outcomes, including ASES scores, and no long-term survivorship analysis for both the groups. Additionally, it was a heterogeneous arthropathy group, which included both glenohumeral arthritis and rotator cuff arthropathy, without any subgroup analysis in these.
All right, excellent. And last presentation for this session is Dr. Nisha Kali from WashU, revision total elbow arthroplasty, rates and predictors of reoperation at a single institution.
All right, good morning. My name's Nisha. I'm a resident from WashU, and today I'll discuss our work on revision total elbow arthroplasty, rate, and predictors of reoperation at a single institution. Here are the disclosures. I have no relevant disclosures. Total elbow arthroplasty reliably improves pain and function across many elbow pathologies. However, unfortunately, it does carry one of the highest complication and revision rates of all major joint replacements. While recent data from our institution shows 10-year revision-free survival of about 80% after primary total elbow arthroplasty, the long-term outcomes after revision total elbow arthroplasty remain poorly defined. And so this study evaluates reoperation and re-revision rates after index revision total elbow arthroplasty at our high-volume center, and also identifies predictors of failure. We retrospectively reviewed all index revision TEAs performed at WashU from 1999 to 2022, and we included only cases involving exchange of at least one bone fixed humeral or ulnar component. Primary outcomes were subsequent reoperation and fixed implant re-revision or explantation. We collected demographics, smoking status, surgical indication, allograft use, and radiographic parameters. The mean follow-up for our cohort of revisions was about 12.8 years. 49 elbows in 47 patients ultimately met the inclusion criteria, and the mean age was 58.4 years, and about 28.6% of the sample was male. The main indication for revision was aseptic loosening in about 82% of our sample, and then sequela of infection in about 19%. The majority of our implants used were the Stryker Latitude implant. 60% of elbows, which is 29 out of 49, unfortunately required at least one reoperation for a total of 80 procedures. The mean time to first reoperation was 4.1 years, and the most common non-revision reoperation was wound-related complications and infection. Fixed implant re-revision or explantation was required in 42.9% of elbows. At 5 years, about 64% remained free of fixed implant re-revision. At 10 years, this number dropped to about 57%. Patients who required reoperation or re-revision were significantly younger, 55 versus 64 years for reoperation, and 53 versus 63 years for re-revision. Discussing survival, Kaplan-Meier analysis demonstrated markedly shorter times to reoperation and re-revision when the index revision procedure was performed for infection sequela compared with aseptic loosening. Specifically looking at structural allograft, use of allograft at revision was strongly associated with failure. 82% of elbows with structural allograft did require a reoperation versus 47% without it. and re-revision rates were 71% versus 28%. Current smoking was a very powerful predictor of failure. 85% of active smokers required reoperation compared with 50% of non-smokers, and re-revision rates were 80% versus 31%. Survival curves again highlight the substantial difference between smokers and non-smokers. In summary, revision total elbow arthroplasty carries substantially higher reoperation and re-revision rates than primary total elbow arthroplasty, which is driven primarily by infection and aseptic loosening. Younger age, active smoking, and structural allograft use significantly increases risk. Our data does suggest that revision total elbow arthroplasty should be approached with caution, particularly in active smokers, and that our patients would benefit from improved soft tissue techniques with better implant options. Thank you.
All right, excellent job. Please feel free to reach out with any questions. Dr. Gerald?
Yeah. I'll start with a question for Dr. Colley. So it seems that if we address the wound and infection issues, we'd have a significant decrease in our reoperation rate. Did you guys look at all at differences in soft tissue handling or antibiotic protocols or any of those things that you think may be driving the differences in who we're getting reoperations on?
We did look at those rates, and I think the difficulty with total elbow replacement is that oftentimes we think that maybe there was indolent infection in a large amount of these revision patients because of the number of patients that were revised for infection. About half of them had indolent infection later, and the majority, I believe about 75% of those, required multiple soft tissue reconstructions and procedures such as flaps, et cetera. So I do think that's a largely unsolved problem. The soft tissue insult, the use of structural allograft, the elbow is not a very forgiving joint, and we haven't really figured out a great way to address that when we have so much bone loss and soft tissue insult.
Kind of a follow-up question. Dr. Clark, you mentioned we got to do better with arthroplasty, and then you have Dr. Colley's study, which shows that even when we think we do well at arthroplasty, we're terrible. Obviously a challenging problem, the salvage procedure, the arthrodesis, it's a small number. What's your take home from this? Is this even a procedure that we should offer patients, or is the explant, where we're seeing 20% of our revision patients after these arthroplasties, is that better? It's a big question, but what's kind of your take home from the arthrodesis study here?
I think this is a last resort option only if needed. I asked Dr. Mori, one of our shoulder elbow surgeons up there, about this, and he said he's never done an elbow arthrodesis and he never will. So try to avoid it at all costs.
Yeah, he learned from the mistakes of his father. So that was a big part of it for sure. Yeah.
My next question is for Dr. Lazara. So you found no pathology in 41% of the arthroscopy patients you took back to the OR, but they did have a positive lidocaine challenge. How do you explain that result? And then how did you care for those patients afterwards?
Yeah, as far as explaining the result, I think there's possible, I think it's pretty difficult to explain as far as there's no driving intra-articular pathology that at least we could visualize or that came out of the tissue sampling. So, we incubated all the tissues for greater than 14 days, so I don't think it was an indolent infection that was lying dormant. But it's also possible that we didn't sample tissue from all the correct areas because it was up to the orthopedic surgeon's discretion as far as which tissues were sampled. So I guess I would lean towards an infectious etiology more than mechanical. And as far as management, a lot of the non-operative patients got better with continued physical therapy, just general physical therapy as far as range of motion exercises and rotator cuff strengthening.
Just a quick follow-up. Do you know what percentage of those patients were reverse that you didn't have obvious?
Not off the top of my head.
Because the only thing that I would comment is we're less likely to offer an intervention to a reverse because you don't have anything you can really give them, right? You have an anatomic. You can always say, hey, I can convert you to reverse if we didn't really see anything. But it's just something when you're looking at that data to help sort it out as a possible confounder. Dr. Patel, 2014, that's interesting, inflection point when you saw that. And I think you mentioned a couple things, a couple studies that came out around that time, decreased healing rate with more than 2. I think that's based on a Pearl Diver study, increased infection, obviously, with more. Other things that you might think be a part of that, is this hey, we're getting understanding that some of these things, natural history do better. I don't think we're that altruistic, and injections don't pay as well as surgery. So what happened in 2014? Is there anything that you kind of think that, or is this just a trend that we're seeing? And then second question, did you see any differences between the Medicare database and the private insurance database in terms of that difference? Because I could also see that potentially being a driver.
Yeah, I looked into that, see like what was caused that inflection point. Around that time was when a lot of the hip and knee arthroplasty paperwork around infection risk. So I think that was a trend that was kind of carrying over to shoulder arthroplasty. And around that same time is also when a lot of the biomechanical studies on like rats, seeing the tendon degradation. So a lot of the actual studies on humans were later in like 2019, 2020. And then for your second question, remind me of that again.
Any differences between the Medicare database and the private insurance database?
Yeah, I think we didn't really specify between the two of them. The big thing we got out of them was the Medicare was giving us that older population for more the arthroplasty group, rather the private was more of the rotator cuff. So I think we can look into that more in depth afterwards.
And then I have a question for Dr. Sheet. So obviously it'd be advantageous for surgeons to have a separate CPT code, especially given the higher hospital cost, longer operative times, et cetera, to account for that complexity. What are the barriers to creating that different CPT code? And then how do you recommend that surgeons advocate for that CPT code change?
Yeah. So I think a lot of the barriers kind of stem from people when kind of go through like the CPT code formation and whatnot for like the RVU reimbursement. People, if you come to them and say like, oh, this surgery is more difficult, it's currently the same CPT code, you may say that, okay, you're getting this many RVUs, particularly for this surgery, but then if this surgery is getting this, then the decrease for like elective indications to being like less RVUs in that case. That's actually one of the comments we got from when we were having our article reviewed, particularly is the fear kind of that would be the overall cost for that. But if you look at the data really for like proximal humerus fractures, compare that to like revision, shoulder arthroplasty, the clinical outcomes are pretty similar actually based on just like a preliminary look. I don't have like the direct data to back it up, but it'd be interesting to kind of compare and contrast revision versus proximal humerus fractures in comparing those clinical outcomes, because then that can maybe create the argument that, okay, these are having worse outcomes, more healthcare expenditure. Maybe we should reevaluate for more proper billing, more proper coding, things like that in that case.
Any questions from the audience or? All right, perfect. Great job. We'll move on to the next section here.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Leem and Dr. Giroux. By the way, Kate Giroux, a few years ago, I think, Kate, you were the national winner of the competition. So great to see you back on the podium in a different role. So terrific. The next session is trauma. And again, we have our moderators or our faculty member, Dr. David Brogan and Kate Hadju, who is the resident moderator. So they'll come forward to do the moderating. David and... Oh, okay, Dr. Wilbur. Dr. Wilbur's phone. Okay, so Dr. Wilbur will be the co-moderator as well. Okay, well, we'll get this session started. Dr. Clemmer and Dr. Okay, good.
Hey guys, good morning. Thanks for those of you who traveled, thanks for making the trip to St. Louis. Hopefully you came in over the weekend because you got the 2 days of spring that we'll have in St. Louis and just be hot and humid for the rest. So we're going to start the session now on trauma or trauma-related literature. And so we all know trauma and kind of fixing fractures is the foundation for a lot of orthopedic surgery. I'm one of the orthopedic oncologists here, and certainly metastatic disease and pathologic fractures are a huge part of my practice. So I think while this session is labeled trauma, it's certainly applicable to all of us in whatever career we do. So the first one is Dr. Alder from Mayo Clinic. It's going to talk about outcome of radial nerve palsy and closed humeral shaft fractures treated operatively and expectantly.
Alrighty, thank you all for the opportunity to speak this morning. Any relevant disclosures to this paper can be found on the AOS disclosure website. So radial nerve palsy and diaphyseal humeral shaft fractures is the most common peripheral nerve injury associated with a long bone fracture, with an overall incidence of about 12.3%. This is due to its intimate location within the spiral groove of the posterior humerus, which predisposes the nerve to contusion, crush, entrapment, or laceration during fracture. Manipulation and immobilization or open reduction internal fixation can also predispose to radial nerve palsy. Fortunately, radial nerve palsies do have a high rate of spontaneous recovery without operative intervention. In open fractures, there is no debate about what to do. They're unanimously treated with debridement, irrigation, open reduction, internal fixation, and osteosynthesis. However, in closed fractures, there's a little bit of thought about what to do. Historically, these are treated with conservative management, but there is a paradigm shift that has been noted in the literature recently with a move towards open reduction internal fixation for humeral shaft fractures with a concomitant nerve palsy, with the thought that this may increase the regenerative potential of the nerve. Therefore, the primary objective of this investigation was to delineate the timeline of radial nerve regeneration in patients with closed humeral shaft fractures accompanied by radial nerve palsy, managed both conservative and with surgical intervention. The secondary objective was to evaluate the influence of nerve mechanism, injury mechanism, and fracture pattern on the trajectory of radial nerve recovery. A retrospective review was performed of all adult patients who sustained a closed aphyseal humeral shaft fracture with concomitant radial nerve palsy between 2010 and 2022, treated at our level 1 trauma and tertiary care academic institutions. Patients who did not have at least one follow-up had secondary radial nerve palsy, multiple nerve injuries, and or associated injuries of the ipsilateral upper extremity were excluded. Patients were subsequently divided into expectant and operatively managed patients. Patient demographics, injury mechanism, concomitant injuries, fracture location pattern, fracture treatment modality, surgical details, motor unit strength, sensation, and time to early and full nerve recovery were recorded. Time to recovery was compared between the two treatment modalities. Time to recovery between fracture mechanism and pattern was also compared. In our cohort, all patients had full nerve recovery within 53 weeks. The mean onset of initial radial nerve recovery was 8.4 weeks, and full recovery was achieved at an average of 33 weeks in the entire cohort. On delineation between the two operative or non-operative treated groups, statistical analysis did not demonstrate any significant difference to the onset of and full recovery between patients treated conservatively and operatively. Similarly, the mechanism of injury, high and low, there was no statistical difference between the onset of and full recovery of the radial nerve. And finally, the pattern of fracture did not change the onset of or full recovery of the radial nerve. The limitations of the study include those inherent to any retrospective design. This was a single referral institution with a very high loss of follow-up and a subsequent small sample size. However, radial nerve associated closed humeral shaft fractures have a very high rate of spontaneous nerve recovery with similar onset of full and recover of the nerve despite the treatment chosen, the mechanism of the fracture, or the fracture pattern. Closed humeral shaft fractures with concomitant radial nerve palsy should not be an indication for operative treatment with the hope of decreasing the time to nerve recovery. Thank you.
Next, I'd like to welcome up Dr. Kurpati, who's going to be talking about subcutaneous fat overlying the knee joint versus BMI to predict wound complications after total knee arthroplasty.
Good morning. Thanks everyone for inviting us to talk. I'm Stephen. I'm one of the third-year residents here. I'll be giving a talk titled Subcutaneous Fat Overlying the Knee Can Predict Wound Complications After Elective Knee Arthroplasty. I want to take a moment to thank the sponsors, donors, and my co-authors. So we all know that higher BMI is associated with infection following knee arthroplasty. I think it's unclear based on some recent literature whether or not it's the systemic effects of obesity and metabolic syndrome versus what we hypothesize to be the local adipose distribution overlying the actual knee. We wanted to look at subcutaneous thickness versus BMI as risk factors for infection following knee arthroplasty. We started by including everyone that underwent primary elective knee arthroplasty at our institution that were over 18 years of age and also had complete x-rays, including the complete soft tissue profile. We went into measuring some preoperative findings on radiographs, which I'll get into, but we also collected demographic information as well as our outcomes of importance, which are SSI, prosthetic joint infection, and dehiscence. We looked at 3 different radiographic measures. I'll go into those now. First is the prepatellar fat thickness ratio. We took a line that spanned the patella and at the midpoint drew another reference perpendicular line. From here, we measured the skin thickness and put that over the bone thickness. Next is the knee adipose index. We recorded this on the AP radiograph. As you can see, we took a line from the most proximal aspect to the medial plateau, and then similarly on the lateral aspect, we measured the skin-to-skin thickness and then divided that over the bone-to-bone thickness. Finally is the POSTI, or the periarticular soft tissue index. We took 2 reference lines, one for the femur, one for the tibia. The femur one started at the superior pole of the patella, went to intersect the posterior aspect of the femoral condyle, and then you'll see the tibial reference line went from the proximal medial aspect of the tibia. And then similarly, we took the skin-to-skin distances and divided them by the bone-to-bone distances, respectively, for the tibia and the femur. This is our demographics table. I just want to call your attention to the very bottom part of it where it looks at our rates of PJI and wound dehiscence. We had 9 of our total 530 approximate cohort of patients that that were found to have prosthetic joint infection, and then approximately 26 of the patients in our sample had wound dehiscence, or 5%. So we found that no soft tissue indices were significantly associated with prosthetic joint infection. Unsurprisingly, we found that higher BMI was associated with prosthetic joint infection. We did find that non-operative wound dehiscence was associated with the following radiographic parameters. Morbid obesity, again, not too surprising, a higher tibial periarticular soft tissue index, and a lower femoral periarticular soft tissue index. Again, these are the results looking at the significance of all of these risk factors on prosthetic joint infection. We found, again, that only BMI as a continuous factor was the one that was significantly associated with this. Some limitations of our study include the fact that it is retrospective, and we didn't have a great number of total prosthetic joint infections, which in many situations is good, and this situation didn't give us that much predictive ability, I think. I think another issue is the fact that the consistency of the lateral profile of the knee in radiographs is variable, so I think this can also change our measurements. So what do these soft tissue indices mean, and how can we use these in considering patients for elective knee arthroplasty? I think while the study didn't find that they're predictive of prosthetic joint infection or other major surgical complications, I think it shows that they have some ability to predict non-surgical wound complications. And interestingly, we can get into this later, but I think nutrition still remains paramount here. I think muscle mass can be a confounding factor in the tibial and femoral POSTI metrics that we're measuring, and we know sarcopenia does have a unique interplay here. So thank you so much for your time.
Okay, next up we have a collaborative study out of WashU between Dr. Gisei, who's not here, and Dr. Helena Barber, who will be presenting Disparities Beyond Healing, a prospective study evaluating ballistic femur and tibia shaft fractures.
All right, I'll be presenting this on behalf of Dr. Gisei, who admittedly did the vast majority of the work on this study. A little background, nationwide, the burden of ballistic injuries has been increasing over the past 2 decades, and we certainly see our fair share here in St. Louis. The majority of these are low extremity, so femur and tibia. Prior research has established that patients with ballistic fractures are more likely to be young, male, African American. They have higher rates of complications and reoperations. They have lower rates of follow-up compliance. They have higher rates of ED utilization. And then other psychosocial factors have been associated with pain and disability. These are some studies that we use to kind of design and guide our studies. So the top one noted that ballistic injuries had lower PROMIS scores when compared with the general population. And then both of these studies, one of the things to focus on was how to get better follow-up rate. So the top study used phone call reminders, and the bottom study actually provided transportation to clinic and was able to get a follow-up rate of greater than 90%. Prior studies had follow-up rates of about 30% at 3 months for these injuries. Overall, to date, there is no prospective analysis of patient-reported outcomes after ballistic tibia and femur fractures. Our goal is to quantify the differences in mental health, social health, and physical function PROMIS scores, as well as see some of the outcomes after these fractures. Methods: we enrolled adult patients 18 years or older with traumatic tibia or femoral shaft fractures, treated with surgical fixation. These were all isolated injuries, so we eliminated the polytrauma patients. We collected demographic data, and then the primary outcomes were complications, readmission rates, ED visits, mortality, follow-up, and then PROMIS scores. A lot of different PROMIS scores out there. We focused on mental health, social health, and then physical function. Some of our results, kind of as consistent with prior literature, our ballistic group was more likely to be male and African American. The ballistic group had higher rates of tobacco, substance, and alcohol use, and they had higher associated neurovascular injuries. We found that there's no significant difference in non-PROMIS clinical outcomes, including readmission, emergency department use, surgical or medical complications. Some of our results: at 3 months, the trend towards worse mental health scores was seen in the ballistic group, but did not reach significance. There was worse social participation and higher pain intensity at 3 months for the ballistic group, but all of these at every other time point did not show a significant difference. Follow-up at 3 months, Follow-up. The average follow-up was similar between groups, about 6 months. Nearly 80% of patients were seen for their 3-month clinic follow-up. However, this did decline significantly by a year. Overall, we did not quite meet our target for sample size for our initial power analysis. This was mitigated by the longitudinal data that was collected. Our PROMIS scores did not fully capture all of the specific psychological outcomes, but overall, we found similar patient-reported outcomes at 1 year. I think one of the main takeaways was the ability to have much better follow-up rates in these patients with providing phone call reminders, as well as they got financial support and transportation assistance to make it to clinic. Overall, longer-term perspectives are still needed to see the true impact of these injuries.
Next, I'd like to welcome up Dr. Ward, who's presenting Does suprapatellar nailing of ballistic tibia fractures cause a risk for septic arthritis?
Thank you very much for the introduction. Let's see, how's this advance? How's this advance? Green arrow. Okay, there we go. I'd like to start by thanking the OREF for the opportunity to speak here today, as well as acknowledge my co-investigators who assisted with this study. This study was born out of the transition at our institution to primarily utilizing a suprapatellar approach for tibial nailing for diaphyseal fractures, a trend that mirrors that of the orthopedic community in general. The suprapatellar approach offers benefits in patient positioning, acquiring and maintaining reduction, as well as acquiring intraoperative fluoroscopic imaging. This proves particularly advantageous in our institution, where a preponderance of our fractures are from a ballistic nature. And I think you can appreciate how using that semi-extended position would be beneficial with these highly comminuted, length unstable, and lack of cortical reads. So this suprapatellar approach is not without risk. It requires instrumentation and implants to be delivered through the knee joint, which could place the knee at risk of seeding an infection from a contaminated open fracture. And this has previously been investigated in injuries with blunt mechanisms where a 1.4% rate of septic arthritis was identified. Now, while many of the ballistic fractures have small wounds with minimal visible soft tissue damage, other ones result in a significant amount of soft tissue loss with bone exposure that can seed the joint with infectious organisms. And now infection in any situation can be a potentially devastating consequence, but particularly at our institution, our ballistic fractures are associated with polymicrobial and multi-drug resistant organisms and fungi. So the purpose of our study was to investigate the suprapatellar approach and see if it resulted in increased risk for septic arthritis after nailing of ballistic tibia fractures. We retrospectively reviewed the data at our institution, identifying patients by the CPT code for tibial intramedullary nailing, and included patients with a minimum of 1 month follow-up. We identified a total of 69 patients, 62 of which met the minimum follow-up criteria either at our institution or through linked healthcare records. 45 of these were managed with the suprapatellar approach and 17 with either an infrapatellar or parapatellar approach. Across the approaches, there was no difference in patient demographics, injury characteristics, or operative management. And notably, there was only one case of septic arthritis that was identified, and this occurred in the infrapatellar approach. This patient presented 35 days after their initial surgery with a gram-positive bacilli on their OR cultures. We further looked at all causes of surgical site infection and identified approximately 20% rate with no differences across the different approaches. That occurred at a mean of 6 months after surgery. We looked at risk factors for developing all forms of surgical site infection, did not find any amongst demographics, antibiotic prophylaxis, surgical management, or injury characteristics. So limitations of our study was retrospective data, and as has been noted with the trauma population, loss to follow-up is a significant factor, particularly in this case where we would have ultimately lost another third of our cohort with a minimum 6-month follow-up, which was that mean time to presentation for infection. We also did not identify any or assess any PROs or radiographic healing in this study. Well, the key takeaway is that despite the theoretical risks, suprapatellar nailing did not result in any cases of septic arthritis. The risk of infection is high with this injury characteristic, but that is independent of approach, and suprapatellar nailing is a safe and viable option for management of these injuries. Thank you.
Okay, and last for this session is Arch Tapuzian from UIC discussing preoperative IV iron and does it improve outcomes after femur fracture surgery. Sorry? Okay, so questions? Awesome, sorry about that. I guess, does anybody from the audience want to kick it off? We'll go reverse order from last time. Yeah, Dr. Song.
Hey, this is a question for the subcutaneous fat thickness study in total knees. Interesting study. I think that, you know, there's certainly importance in the surgical site adiposity in terms of risk factor. Just curious, did you find any correlation between actual BMI and the amount, that POSTI value or the thickness of the subcutaneous tissue at the knee? Yeah, I know there's some overlap in terms of outcomes with increased BMI and increased fat thickness, but did you find any interplay between the two?
Hey, thanks for your question. I don't think we actually compared those two. That wasn't like a comparison of interest that we were looking at. But yeah, I definitely echo the interplay there because, you know, you could have central or peripheral obesity. You can have sarcopenia versus, you know, normal muscle mass, and those all things are going to confound BMI. So I think everyone's looking for like a perfect number, and it's not, as we know now, it's not really a number. makes people eligible for arthroplasty.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think since we're on the topic, I think it's a really fascinating one, because you think about the big person with a small leg and the small person with a really big leg. And so when I'm working with residents, and, oftentimes we'll put stitches in fat to close down dead space, but that's not your strength layer, right? I don't think it's really a barrier from the outside world to infection. Maybe it just is a surrogate for a longer operation or a more difficult operation, or the central obesity probably more linked to their overall biologic impacts of obesity. So one, thought, your strength layer, and probably a better reflection, as you note, is muscle mass and the setting of how obese they are. So it's hard on an x-ray, but you can kind of discern fat from muscle. And I wonder if you just went up a little bit higher and measured a ratio of like their VMO thickness to their fatness, or, this whole ratio. Am I just a big muscular kind of fat lineman, or am I the jellyfish pancake that,
Yeah, that's a great thought. And when we were reviewing this data from one of our research students, we were like, oh, is there any way we can get this number? And we looked at a couple x-rays, and we thought it would be a poor measurement just on the lateral knee x-ray. And we were talking about then we'd have to find people with CTs of the knee to really get a good measurement of their VMO, right?
Sure.
And that's kind of what I was alluding to at the end, with the femoral opacity being a lower number. So it's a really interesting idea, and I think we're looking at different ways to do that. I know in spine literature they look at the MF in the back and some of the other paraspinal muscles, and they use that as a marker for fusion rates. So
Sure. And so I know it's not a good marker for nutrition, but did you control for albumin or any other?
We didn't. That would have really thinned our sample down, so we weren't able to.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Dr. O'Keefe?
Yeah, I was going to ask Dr. Alder a question. When you open fractures, was the exploration of the nerve, or because that often can, maybe be a component of it. I'm also interested if you have any insight about, sometimes you have nerve intact and you do want to put plates and screws on, some stretch to the nerve, and you get a palsy. If you have had any insight about potentially that group, and or looking at that, or was that group, I'm sure you have some of those patients as well. Any insight about that? So those two questions.
Perfect, that's better. So for the first question, you're asking, so for the ones that did undergo operative intervention, we identified the nerve, did not neuralize the entirety of it or stimulate it or anything like that. Just pure neurolysis for the sake of being able to get a plate under it. For the second one, all secondary nerve palsies were excluded, but I would be curious to see what the regenerative potential for those specific cases would be, to see if it would be different. I would assume that it would probably be the same. I think that when you look at the literature before the study, there's some papers by Anazari, Shao, and then a recent one in Journal of Hand Surgery by Gonzalez. They're a little bit messier. They have open fractures. They have closed fractures. They have high energy, multiple nerve injuries, plexus injuries. And their numbers or their regenerative weeks were a little bit more delayed in those folks, but about the same.
On the same topic, I know relatively small sample size, but were there any gross different, I know you looked at fracture pattern, but any other gross differences between those that were managed expectantly and operatively? And kind of the way that I would think about the question is, if I was arm wrestling my friends and got this spiral humeral shaft fracture with a nerve palsy, I'm asking David Brogan to take me to surgery tomorrow to explore my nerve and put it back together, because I need, and put my humerus back together because I need it, and I need it without a doubt. It's my mom, probably put her in a Sarmiento and understand that it's going to it's more than likely going to get better. So within your cohort, did you see any differences, maybe occupation, age, that kind of stuff?
No, overall, the 15 patients are pretty similar. There's an average age of about 55. Most of them were sustained by ground level fall or, something simple like pickleball. There were like 4 that we grouped as a high energy trauma, but it was actually isolated to the upper extremity where they had this mid-shaft fracture. So no gross differences.
Gotcha.
Dr. Barber, for the looking at the pain that persisted, it was 3 months, 6 months. Their pain intensity in the ballistic group was higher, but then that all seemed to resolve at 12 months. To me, is that more of the initial trauma and the healing is slower just because of the increased initial trauma? Because I wouldn't expect their like psychosocial state to change that much over that year.
Sure. Yeah, I think ballistic injuries, of course, a range, but generally a high risk of soft tissue trauma and more comminution. I think something else that was a limitation of ours is we say they equalized at 1 year, but we had a huge drop off and follow-up at 1 year. So when we're looking at those comparisons, we have a much, much smaller sample size, so a little bit hard to draw strong conclusions at the 12-month mark. Kind of the 3-month was where we still retained enough to be able to kind of, I think, more confidently talk about numbers.
Dr. Barber on the same, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, Dr. Brogan.
Please, yeah.
Question about, so Dr. Barber, as the person who had their tibia nailed, injuries, and mine was lateral approach. So did you see any difference in the approaches from post-operative knee pain and or radiographic outcomes long term? Maybe you don't have the data for that, but any other, aside from septic arthritis, like differences in like pre-patella nailing versus lateral we don't have any of the VAS outcomes or any sort of reports of knee pain afterwards. There's ongoing efforts to quantify the amount of radiographic healing as well as alignment with both the approaches in these populations. That data collection and analysis is still ongoing.
Yeah, this probably exists out there, and the reason that there's multiple approaches means the answer to this question is probably there's no difference, but it's not. As a non-traumatologist who isn't super up to speed on this literature, we care about septic arthritis, partly from patients can get sick and, want them to get septic and all of that, but really, we treat it as an orthopedic emergency because of arthritis, right? And so if the sequelae is arthritis after septic arthritis, is the, suprapatellar nailing not necessarily associated with septic arthritis, but is it associated with long-term arthritis because you've now, introduced a bunch of bone marrow into the joint, you've gone through reamers several times, maybe I'm not so diligent about protecting the patella and I put a reamer right through that. Do you know if that either in your data set or just out there that data exists? Is it more associated with arthritis?
Yeah, our patient population certainly does not follow up long enough to have any inclination of whether or not they developed just post-traumatic arthritis. There have been several studies that have gone back and done arthroscopic evaluation after suprapatellar approaches, and I think unequivocally they find that there's been damage, particularly to the patellofemoral joints. So I think you can likely presume that these patients will develop patellofemoral arthritis at some point in the future. The degree to which it becomes symptomatic is to be determined.
We are now moving on to session 3 of the resident research presentations. This is going to be moderated by David Brogan. David's a clinician scientist. He's had considerable funding from the OREF, also NIH now. So congratulations, David. And also Helena Barber. And this is going to be on hand and elbow. So we're moving towards upper extremity. So David and Helena.
All right, excellent. We have a wonderful session on hand and elbow. So if I can ask to make things a little bit easier, let's have all of our presenters come and sit in the front row to minimize travel time. So Dr. Jen, Dr. Yu, Dr. Poff, Dr. Osten, and Dr. Yi, if you all can come up and make your way to the front. And then starting off, Dr. Jan from Rush University will talk to us about the preliminary outcomes of scapholunate interosseous ligament reconstruction using the button-assisted internal brace technique.
All right, thanks so much. My name is Kylene. I'm a third-year resident at Rush. Thanks for your time today. So scapholunate instability remains a challenging problem in hand and wrist surgery. SL tears are often missed early, and they lead to a predictable path of instability and degeneration. It's really in the last 50 years that we've been better able to understand this pathology, and we've devised many reconstruction techniques, each with their own advantages and setbacks. What we have learned from all this experience, though, is that it's not enough to just reconstruct the SL ligament. You need to address at least one of the so-called critical stabilizers to correct the DZ deformity. So these are the long radial lunate, the DIC, or the SCT ligaments. So the way we see it is the goals of modern SL reconstruction should be to 1, reduce the scaphoid and lunate, 2, restore carpal kinematics, and 3, rebuild at least one of the 3 critical stabilizers, all of course while still being a durable and safe surgical technique. So that's where our technique, the BABE technique, comes in. I'll show very quickly how it works and how it achieves those 3 goals. We start by drilling tunnels through the proximal row and out a separate ulnar incision. We assemble a cortical button with fiber wire going one way and suture tape going the other. We pass that suture tape through the proximal row and we tension it using a second cortical button. So when we do this, this motion actually reduces the scaphoid and lunate, which you can see in this video here, thereby helping us achieve goal number 1. Next, we take a slip of FCR, we thread it from volar to dorsal through the scaphoid and tack it down to the lunate using an all-suture suture anchor. And then we pass it continuously to the triquetrum and tack it down there. So this phase has helped us recreate the dorsal SL ligament, which helps us restore or achieve our second goal. Finally, we still have a long slip of FCR left, so we actually bring that back radially and secure it to the scaphoid using our second fiber wire there. So this move here recreates and reinforces the DIC ligament, overall helping us achieve our third goal. So I would say the unique features of our technique are that we're utilizing the entire proximal row for stability, we're mitigating tendon creep with an internal brace, and we're recreating both the dorsal and almost a new intrasubstance part of the SL ligament. And here's what the final product looks like on radiographs. So because this is a relatively new technique, the purpose of our study today was to evaluate the clinical and radiographic outcomes in patients undergoing the surgery, and we hypothesized that they would demonstrate favorable outcomes. This was a retrospective study of 22 patients undergoing this technique with at least 6 months of follow-up. We measured these radiographic parameters and collected PROs, and we measured range of motion and grip strength all before and after surgery. And just for visual reference, here are the radiographic measurements that we collected. In terms of our results, on average, our patients were young, mostly male, and underwent surgery at less than a year after surgery. About 60% of our patients did have a DZ deformity, so we are dealing with a spectrum of SL instability here. Our post-op PROs were significantly improved, with scores indicating minimal pain and disability. The range of motion was also really well maintained. So for example, our flexion decreased by 2.5 degrees, but this was not significant. Similarly, extension was not significantly decreased. We did see a significant decrease in the grip strength compared to the contralateral side by about 14%. Moving on to our radiographic outcomes, we saw significant improvements in the SL gap, the SL angle, and also the radial lunate angle. Specifically, the gap was reduced by a mean of 1.6 millimeters. The SL angle, which we used to determine our DZ deformity, was reduced by an average about 10 degrees. And then finally, the radial lunate angle was reduced by an average of 7.6 degrees. Of course, every technique has complications, and we saw 3. One developed progressive arthritis, one developed CRPS, and one experienced hardware irritation requiring removal of the ulnar button at about a year after surgery. So in conclusion, the BABE technique is a promising option for SL reconstruction. It improves carpal alignment, it preserves wrist motion, and has a low complication rate. In terms of future investigations, we look forward to assessing long-term durability and comparing its effectiveness relative to other techniques in a clinical setting. Thanks so much for your time.
All right, next up, we have Dr. Yu from Mayo Clinic presenting osteochondritis dissecans, lesions of the elbow in adolescent athletes, public health directed evaluation via point of care ultrasound screening.
Hi, I'm Kristen. I'm a resident at the Mayo Clinic, presenting on behalf of our group on OCD lesions of the elbow in adolescent athletes, public health directed education via point of care ultrasound. My co-authors have the following disclosures. No funding was obtained for this research. OCD lesions are characterized by disruption of subchondral bone and overlying cartilage and are associated with a higher risk of premature degenerative changes about any joint that they are located in, but in this case, the elbow. Capitellar OCD lesions are relatively rare with a reported incidence between 2 and 3%. The at-risk population is adolescents who demonstrate repetitive valgus loading across the elbow, particularly gymnasts and overhead throwing athletes. Research from our colleagues in Japan has demonstrated that successful non-operative treatment, the rates of successful non-operative treatment are lower with more advanced stage disease. And at the prefecture level in Kyoto, ultrasound is being used as a point of care ultrasound screening tool for various musculoskeletal injuries, mostly about the shoulder girdle, lower back, and elbow. So we wanted to follow their lead and see whether this was a potential efficacious tool here in the US. So we sought to educate at-risk athletes and their families, coaches, and trainers regarding different causes of elbow pain and to evaluate the utility of ultrasound as a diagnostic screening tool for capitellar OCD lesions. This was a prospective observational cross-sectional study. This was conducted at one adolescent youth baseball tournament in Minnesota in August 2025. We included athletes between the ages of 10 to 18 years who were playing in the tournament, who spoke English, and because they were participating in the tournament, they participated in overhead throwing or sports or gymnastics. Parental consent was obtained as well as assent from the subject, and then everyone completed a standardized questionnaire on subject demographics, sports participation and history, including non-throwing sports, elbow pain characteristics, if any, and medical and surgical history, after which a bilateral upper extremity exam was performed by a member of the study team, and then a focused lateral elbow ultrasound was performed of the throwing arm. Notably for the physical exam, we did look at various provocative maneuvers, including elbow extension impingement, moving valgus stress test, arm-bar tests, and the capitellar shear test. So we ultimately enrolled 108 players. 4 were excluded for incomplete data. Again, this was a baseball tournament, so athletes were kind of running off the field, running on the field, and then by the end we had 104 total sets of complete data. The average age of the players that were coming through was about 13 years. They've been playing for an average of 7 years and an average of 4 days per week. They reported that they were throwing an average of 42 pitches in a single day. The majority were right-handed athletes and multi-sport athletes. Again, the majority were either pitchers or catchers, but many played multiple positions. Few reported, or only a quarter of patients reported prior injury or to that elbow, and only one had prior surgery. With respect to elbow pain characteristics from our survey, 85 players reported any prior elbow pain, so prior to coming to this tournament when we were screening them. This had been going on for an average of 16 months, according to their reports. They reported that the majority of this pain was on the medial side of the elbow, but 34 did report lateral-sided elbow pain. 77 of these 85 participants reported that this pain had resolved at some point prior to coming to that tournament, and 69 players, so this is a different question, reported they were currently experiencing elbow pain that had been going on for an average duration of 6 months. Mechanical symptoms were present on physical exam in 14. That was also corroborated on their questionnaires. On the VAS score, the average pain score was 4. About 3/4 of these participants had informed a second party, whether that was a player, a coach, or trainer, of having elbow pain, but only 44 had modified their training accordingly, so whether that was cessation of play or just kind of ramping down their play. On physical exam, there was no significant difference between range of motion between the throwing and non-throwing arms. There was a block to motion in 1 participant. The milking maneuver was positive in 12, positive moving valgus stress test in 31, with an average shear angle of 110 degrees and maximal pain at around 105 degrees. There was painful extension impingement in 17 patients or subjects, a positive armbar test in 10, positive capitellar shear test in 17, and then, sorry, this is kind of obscured by the logo there, with an average capitellar shear angle of 69 degrees and maximal pain at around 77 degrees. Note, the capitellar shear test, it's the same thing as the osteochondral shear test. Dr. Driscoll's been going back and forth as to what he would like to call that. With respect to patients who screened positive on our ultrasound screening, 4 patient or players screened positive for the presence of an osteochondral irregularity or defect on that side of the elbow. There was one stage 1 lesion according to the Matsura classification and 3 stage 2 lesions. And you can see the characteristics of those who screened positive. So with an average duration of 10 months and positive capitellar shear test in 3, so only 75% of the patients, but a positive moving valgus stress test on the other side, 100%. So in conclusion, this was the first time that point-of-care ultrasound had been used as a screening tool in the US, again, modeled after our colleagues in Kyoto. Positive ultrasound screening demonstrated osteochondral irregularities in 4 players, 3 of whom had never sought care for this in any capacity. Limitations of the study, it's a cross-sectional study, so we can't make causational relationships or infer causational relationships between the data points collected here. It's possible that morphologic variants can be picked up on ultrasound, and radiographic confirmation is still needed, but this was to be used as a diagnostic kind of screening tool to identify patients or players who should be referred for further care. This was, in terms of the tournament and who was playing in it, considered like the all-stars of that youth baseball league in Minnesota between these ages. So it does represent the hardest throwing, highest velocity players on each team that were then selected to play in this tournament. And they were male athletes only, which kind of precludes generalizability to a larger audience. But overall, we got really good feedback in terms of providing public health-based education regarding causes of elbow pain. There was a large gap in understanding in the parent and patient and training population in terms of differential causes of elbow pain and when care should be sought. And we're hoping to repeat this again this coming year to see how things change. Thanks.
Excellent, thank you. Our next presenter is Dr. Charles Poff from the University of Chicago with the presentation titled that the pitch timer is not associated with increased upper extremity injury in Major League Baseball pitchers, a 4-year analysis.
All right, in keeping with the baseball theme, this is my retrospective database study assessing upper extremity injury in Major League Baseball after the pitch timer. As we know from every level, from amateur to collegiate to professional, upper extremity injury and specifically UCL surgery is increasing, and there are significant financial implications at the professional level. We also know that pace of play is a major concern of Major League Baseball in 2022. After the 2021 season, MLB implemented a pitch timer system in which a pitcher has an allotted amount of time in seconds between the return throw from the catcher to deliver their next pitch. And then a pertinent background to this discussion, pitch tempo is a slightly separate metric that measures the average amount of time spent between consecutive pitches for a pitcher and doesn't include the return throw from the catcher. Well, what we know that fatigue matters in this equation. Dr. Freehill at Stanford and his group have shown that there's a decline in FCR muscle belly glycogen even only after 75 pitches. AJSM papers have shown that torque increases and velocity decreases even after just 3 innings of pitching. And an AJSM paper from 2006 demonstrated that a reported history of pitching through arm fatigue serves as an independent risk factor for going on to require UCL surgery in their cohort of amateur pitchers. So the question is the pitch timer exacerbating this problem or playing a role in this at the professional level? So we aim to assess the upper extremity injury rate before and after the implementation of the pitch clock. Upper extremity injuries were defined as any forearm, elbow, or shoulder diagnosis that landed time on the team's designated injured list on publicly available data sets. Our secondary outcomes included pitcher tempo, as I discussed, games missed per UEI, and then average fastball velocity and workload as well. What we found is that in the data available in 2 years in the post-pitch clock era, there was no significant difference in any year in the amount of upper extremity injury rate, and that was true for both shoulder injuries as well as forearm and elbow injuries. And that kind of naturally led us to ask the question, well, does the pitch timer allow for a safe amount of time in between pitches, but those who work at a faster pace and have a lower pitcher tempo or amount of time between pitches are those pitchers that are specifically susceptible to increased injury rate, and the answer to that was also no. The average tempo for shoulder injuries, forearm elbow injuries, and uninjured pitchers was not significantly different. Did velocity change before or after the clock? This is a well-documented risk factor, mostly at the amateur and collegiate levels, and has not been shown as consistently at the major league level. However, in our study, there was no difference in velocity before and after the clock. What we did find is that pitchers who spent time on the injured list after a shoulder injury and having been marked with a shoulder injury on the designated IL did spend a significantly longer amount of time and missed more games, 35 compared to 29. And however, this same trend did not exist in the elbow. Overall, the total amount of upper extremity injury in Major League Baseball did not increase after the implementation of the pitch timer. This study was the first to assess pitch tempo or pitcher tempo, and it was not shown to be a risk factor. Velocity was not associated with injury in our cohort, and we think that there may be, based on our data, an association with more significant shoulder pathology in the post-pitch timer era, but we certainly need more data, and I think we'll get there with more years to assess after the implementation of the pitch timer in 2022. Thanks.
All right, next up is Dr. Houston from the University of Illinois at Chicago, presenting differential wrist and elbow outcomes of radial head fractures classified by fracture and surgical type.
Hi, I'm James Elson from the University of Illinois. I have no disclosures for this talk. So radial head and neck fractures are a common elbow injury that are often associated with elbow instability and soft tissue injuries. One such injury had about 4% incidence rate is the Essex-Lopresti injury, which is a radial head and neck fracture sustaining an injury to the interosseous membrane, which causes longitudinal form instability, predisposing patients to wrist injuries or wrist pathologies, which are often underdiagnosed. About 50% of the time, they're completely missed. We don't really know how often these Essex-Lopresti injuries create clinically significant wrist and forearm pathology requiring surgery. Most of the data is limited to small case series. So the purpose of this study was to characterize the incidence and clinical relevance of ELIs using a large national database studies. We hypothesized that more severe injuries would lead to higher need for wrist surgical procedures and more wrist and forearm pathology. We used a ProLiver study for over a 12-year period. We looked at the following ICD and CPT codes throughout that period, and we identified 261,000 patients that we could evaluate for this study. So we did a multivariable logistic regression analysis. We found odds ratios with 95% confidence intervals, controlling for age, sex, and multiple comorbidities. We broke our study down into 4 cohorts. The first one was evaluating displaced and non-displaced fractures, dislocated elbows versus non-dislocated elbows, surgical subgroups, radial head or neck open reduction internal fixation versus radial head arthroplasty or radial head excision. And fourth, in non-displaced fractures, we looked at patients who had diagnosis of radial collateral ligament injuries and those who did not. And ultimately, we looked out for outcomes were which surgical procedures did those patients receive in that time window of data collection. DRUJ procedures, TUCC procedures, wrist arthrodesis, wrist arthroplasty, wrist arthroscopy, or interosseous membrane reconstruction. And secondarily, ICD codes related to wrist pain, forearm pain, interosseous membrane injury. So when we look at the displaced and the non-displaced fractures, we see that displaced fractures had a significantly increased risk of surgeries, procedures done on the DRUJ, wrist arthroplasty, ulnar shortening osteotomies, and 2 times increased odds of all-cause wrist surgeries, as well as increased diagnosis of wrist pain. For patients who suffered an elbow instability event, there was up to a 10 times increased odds in DRUJ surgery and a 6 times increased odds in wrist surgery, all-cause wrist surgeries within the period. And for patients who did not have displaced fractures but did suffer radial collateral ligament injuries, we had insufficient data to talk about surgical procedures of the wrist, but we did have a significantly increased diagnosis of TSCC tears and wrist stiffness, and up to interpretation how the muscle or fascia injury ICD-10 code can be interpreted. When we look at the surgical subgroups, Radial head excision and arthroplasty had a higher patient age on average than the OREF groups, but they also had elevated all-cause procedures, up to a 15 times increase odds of DRUJ procedures for excision, 10 times all-cause wrist surgery, whereas OREF had minimal difference compared to the non-surgically treated groups in those patients. So limitations of this study are, of course, multifold. They are often underreported injuries, so whether it's ICD codes not being entered into the database or failure to image patients, especially in the setting of the polytrauma patient. Symptom code reliability, sometimes these are preliminary diagnoses that are coded and are not necessarily a formal diagnosis with imaging results. Retrospective administrative databases studies do have their own limitations. They fail to classify the fractures, provide clinical patient radiographic outcomes. And of course, there's a selection bias, particularly in the surgical group, in which the surgical choice might be differentiated based on variables that are not properly controlled in the database. In conclusion, displaced radial head and neck fractures have a higher odds of wrist interosseous membrane ligament injury and subsequent wrist surgery. Instability patients, those who had dislocations, had higher odds for surgical intervention for TFCC pathology and ulnar-sided wrist pain. And radial collateral ligament injury in non-displaced fractures correlates with the greater diagnosis of other soft tissues of wrist and forearm. Excision and arthroplasty, oftentimes done in patients who have worse injuries or lower functional desires or needs, and they often reflect worse likelihood of needing wrist procedures or forearm procedures. But there are still significant knowledge gaps that we have regarding the true incidence and the routine management of these Essex-Lopresti injuries. What we can establish is that we need a more systematic way to evaluate the wrist and the forearm in all patients with radial head and neck fractures so we can prevent these consequences from developing later on. Thank you.
Thanks so much. The last talk in this group from Dr. Yi, the effects of isolated zone 5 extensor tendon fight bite injuries on finger range of motion. Should we repair partial lacerations? Do I have the right one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is there a clicker that I can use? Oh, got it. Thanks. Okay. Hi, I'm Heather Yee. I'm from Loyola University, Chicago. Special thanks to my research team. I have no relevant disclosures. Extensor tendon injuries represent about 2 to 12% of all hand injuries and can be categorized into zones that are based on location. Zone 5 injuries of the MCP are the most common because the tendon is superficial in this region and vulnerable to laceration or fight bite here. Previous studies have shown that partial lacerations greater than 50% have been associated with MCP extensor lag, but indications to repair are unclear overall. So the purpose of this study is to quantify the effect of zone 5 extensor tendon laceration width and simulated yoke splinting on MCP extensor lag. We used 25 cadavers for a total of 96 fingers. They were divided into 3 groups that were based on laceration order. Group 1 starting with the ring finger, then small and middle, and then index finger, and then small finger for groups 2 and 3, just to account for potential overpull due to juncture from the adjacent digits. Each finger was then lacerated across 0, 25, 50, and 75% of the tendon transversely, and then run through 50 cycles with flexion extension, first with an extension block splint jig, and then without an extension block splint. Outcomes that were measured include extensor tendon gap as well as MCP range of motion. For the index finger, our results showed that, and not until when 25 to 75% of the tendon was lacerated, there was no significant difference in MCP range of motion. However, when 100% of the tendon was lacerated, MCP range of motion decreased about 15 degrees. It did not affect the adjacent digits, including the middle ring and small finger, significantly. For the ring finger, when 25% of the ring finger was lacerated, this resulted in an immediate 25-degree loss of MCP range of motion, but further laceration width did not appear to increase extensor lag. For the adjacent digits, the index finger, the blue arrow on the right graph, shows that at 25% cut of the ring finger, there was a decrease in range of motion. And then for the middle finger in the orange with the orange arrows, at 25 and 50% cut of the ring finger, there was a decrease in range of motion. And for the small finger, any cut of the ring finger showed a decrease in range of motion at the MCP joint. For the small finger, all laceration widths led to a significant decrease in MCP range of motion and did not affect any of the adjacent digits. For yoke splinting, so we had a couple of graphs that showed that for when the finger was free, there was overall decreased range of motion as you increase the amount of extensor tendon laceration. And then with yoke splinting, there's about a 2-fold decrease in that
in that extensor tendon gap. With all these pieces shown together, the change of tendon gap by percent laceration width was mapped side by side with and without yoke splinting, so yoke splinting in teal and without yoke splinting in orange, and it showed that there was an effective decrease with the yoke splinting in extensor tendon gapping. So for the ring finger and the small finger, there were even 25% laceration might decrease extension at the injured and adjacent digits, and MCP extension loss was the same for both complete and incomplete lacerations. Yoke splinting was also effective at decreasing MCP extensor lag. We did have several limitations. First of all, this is a cadaveric study, so it can really be conclusive for clinical application. And further studies are also needed to determine the functional deficit of these injuries. And in vivo extensor lag might also be compensated for over time by the adjacent junctura. But in conclusion, patients should be counseled on yoke splinting as a non-operative measure for zone 5 extensor tendon injuries. And you might consider repairing even partial extensor tendon lacerations. However, more data is needed overall to define what the MCP extensor lag thresholds would be for functional deficits. Thank you.
All right, excellent. We will start with questions for all of our presenters. Dr. Boyer, never shy, with a question here, please. Use
timing. Sorry, I don't remember who gave the talk on timing in between pitches. It sounds like a Strelzo kind of project, but is your next project going to be looking at the effect of spider tack? Because I remember when they started checking pitchers' hands in 2021, in the summer of 21, a lot of pitchers complained that the ball became more slippery and that they became more prone to elbow injuries. So I'm wondering if that is the next iteration of your study.
It's a great thing to look into. It would be difficult to, I think, obtain that data and see who is using spider tack, who isn't, or I guess what you're saying is, in the post spider tack era. Understood. I think that would be interesting to look at. In a way, our data kind of captured that because the pitch timer and the spider tack issue kind of happened at the same time. But more and more data post 2021 will be interesting. I know that, spider tack kind of goes hand in hand with spin rates, and spin rates is something that has been studied recently. I think there's an OJSM paper that just came out that spin rate is associated with more time spent on the injured list. So something interesting to look into, though.
Dr. Kelly.
I had a question for Dr. Yu for the OCD lesion study. Thought it was really interesting, the screening tool. Is there any plan for your team to compare the diagnostic accuracy of the screening tool with radiograph or MRI results from these patients that did screen positive?
Yeah, so we were IRB approved for one-time contact, so everyone was contacted of their positive or negative screening results. So we didn't pull anyone out of the tournament if they screened positive on that day. When they were subsequently contacted, they were given the option of following up with a member of the care team. So the other co-authors on this paper, besides the PI, are involved in the care of the adolescent throwing athlete in various stages, whether it's non-operative to operative. If they opted to connect to care, they would then, come into the office and they got an X-ray, MRI, everything like that. So of the 4 players who screened positive, they followed up with one of our pediatric hand surgeons. 2 ultimately already got surgery, but it did correlate with what we saw on advanced imaging. We were just trying to see, in that one setting, was this an efficacious tool in terms of identifying earlier stage lesions, ideally, but then also letting people know, hey, there's something going on in your elbow. We should probably calm down a little bit.
Great.
Dr., is it Ouston or Ostin? Ostin. I think one of the strengths of your study is just the sheer number of patients you had in the power. You're able to see those odds ratios. Were you guys able to differentiate when these risk pathologies were identified at time of injury, or if these were all kind of delayed diagnoses with persistent symptoms?
So we are able within the database to look at the timing of the procedure to the timing of essentially timing between the two procedures. I think the reason we don't include that initially is because that data is very skewed, especially in patients who have ulnar-sided wrist pain. They will fail variable amounts of conservative management before undergoing these procedures, and the database does not allow you to parse out the data on when did this patient present with this complaint, especially if the diagnosis change and the ICD code is entered a little bit later. So for instance, you present to the clinic with, wrist pain, or even someone puts in hand pain because that's what the scheduler put in and that's what the resident coded. But then 6 months later, it's identified as a TFCC tear. Maybe that's 18 months, maybe that's 3 years after the initial ICD code or CPT code was performed. So I didn't think it wasn't a strong enough relationship, which is one of the major limitations with the database study. But it is able to be studied. I'm just not sure how much we could really put faith into it. Then, am I able to ask a question for my co-panelists?
Please.
Perfect. So, Eileen, I was curious, when I was looking at your guys' x-rays, I was wondering, when you said that patient had arthritis after the reconstructive procedure, do you know what joint it was? Did it have anything to do with drilling across the lunotriquetral joint, or was there any involvement of the scaphocapitate or capital lunate joints?
Yeah, it was radiocarpal arthritis, so pretty much the classic path that we see with scapholunate instability. But you bring up a good point. I think the potential obstacles that one might face when doing the surgery, like you're drilling tunnels through very small bones, right? If you mess up the tunnels, you can entirely fracture your bones, right? So we would need a lot more numbers to kind of parse that out and see who's at risk for that type of complication, obviously besides surgical technique.
Okay, I think we'll take the time for that. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll have our next three presenters come forward, all from Loyola University, and we'll move to session 4. This is moderated by Matt Silva. Matt is a PhD, he's the Vice Chair for Research, and Ryan Wilbur and Nisha Kale, I believe, will be helping Matt with this and co-moderating. And this is potpourri, so a number of different items here. So look forward to this session.
Thank you, Dr. O'Keefe. Yes, so this is the potpourri, so a little bit of everything. So just a note on the program, there's 5 abstracts in your program, but we're only going to hear from 3 today. So the third and the fourth speaker, Dr. Zayam and Dr. Kim, are not able to be with us today in person. So we're going to go in order. And I will start and introduce the first speaker, and then I will ask Nisha and then Ryan to introduce the next 2. So first up, we have Elizabeth Cho from Loyola University, methylene blue as a biofilm disclosing agent for fracture-related infection and in vitro evaluation.
Alrighty, thank you for having me, and thank you to the OREF for providing funding for this study. As a background, fracture-related infection remains a major challenge in orthopedic trauma, and treatment and eradication of infection can be complicated by the propensity for common microorganisms to form biofilms on implants and bone. A simple technique for early intraoperative visual identification of biofilms could help guide decisions on the extent of debridement, as well as the decision to remove or retain the implant. This is essentially where methylene blue comes in, which has been shown previously to have biofilm staining capabilities, as well as some antimicrobial properties, and as a bonus is also non-toxic to human cells. Prior studies in the arthroplasty literature have demonstrated the potential use of methylene blue as a disclosing agent in the setting of arthroplasty and namely prosthetic joint infection. As a result, the biomaterials studied previously have included those largely used in the arthroplasty setting, whereas stainless steel, which is more commonly used in the orthopedic trauma setting, has not previously been evaluated for its staining properties,
and neither have a couple additional gram-negative organisms, which we studied here. Okay, so the objectives of our study were twofold. First, to evaluate the ability of methylene blue to act as a biofilm disclosing agent in vitro for common biofilm forming organisms involved in fracture-related infection. And we did this using 3 biomaterials commonly used in the orthopedic trauma setting. And secondly, to evaluate if there was any relationship between staining and biofilm burden. We hypothesized that the biofilms of all studied microorganisms would demonstrate visible staining on all of the implant materials. So the main steps of our study methodology included biofilm incubation, methylene blue staining, digital photography, and then quantification of biofilm burden. To form our biofilm, we utilized the CDC biofilm reactor, as shown here, for incubation of each organism. So this allowed for 24 coupons per run, consisting of 8 of each biomaterial. After 48 hours of incubation, we moved on to the methylene blue staining process, which involved 6 coupons of each biomaterial placed in methylene blue solution, followed by a saline rinse to get rid of any planktonic or free-floating bacteria. We then photographed each sample under standardized conditions and quantified staining intensity using an image analysis script that measured the mean blue channel pixel values. Finally, to quantify our biofilm burden, we selected 2 coupons of each biomaterial after the staining process, which were sonicated and subsequently plated in triplicate utilizing a spot dilution plating method, as shown here. And this is just a visual depiction of that process. This process was also repeated for the 2 coupons of each biomaterial that did not undergo the staining process. So these are showing those 2 arms directly from the biofilm reactor, which were not stained. So this is a composite of the coupons imaged and subsequently selected for analysis. Grossly, we found that methylene blue visibly stained most samples, with E. coli and Staph aureus staining a little stronger than the other organisms. This is a heat map and a bar graph that demonstrates the mean staining intensity or blueness, which we used as a measure of our biofilm staining across organisms and implant materials. So you can see that E. coli and Staph aureus demonstrated a higher mean blueness overall. Similarly, titanium appeared to demonstrate a little higher staining, although the organism effect seemed to be stronger than the biomaterial effect here. When we plotted blueness against the colony forming unit or the biofilm burden, individual organisms did not show any statistically significant linear trends. But when we plotted these all on one plot with each other, we did find a linear relationship between blueness and the colony forming units or biofilm burden. When we compared the biofilm burden or colony forming units between stained and unstained samples, that visual depiction where we showed different coupons being plated, we found that the stained samples had significantly lower colony forming units compared to the unstained samples, suggesting some sort of detachment or antimicrobial, possibly, effect of the methylene blue. Interestingly, this was not the case for Staph aureus, however. So this study has several limitations. It is an in vitro model with a small sample test size. We studied limited organisms and we only studied 1 strain per species, so it's possible that this is not generally true of all species of E. coli, for example. And then we use digital photography, which can be affected by different surface reflection and lighting variability, and higher imaging methods such as confocal microscopy could capture methylene blue staining more accurately. So in conclusion, methylene blue demonstrated organism-dependent staining of biofilms on titanium, stainless steel, and PMMA. We found that E. coli and Staph aureus were selectively stained, whereas Staph epidermidis and Acinetobacter did not appear to stain as readily. Staining intensity appeared to positively correlate with biofilm burden overall. And the methylene blue staining process did demonstrate antimicrobial and/or detachment process for all organisms except for Staph aureus. These findings support the possibility of methylene blue as a visual depictor of biofilm burden, but again, further translational studies would be needed. Thank you.
Next, I'd like to welcome Dr. Lingham Pauly presenting the impact of spine trauma registries, a systematic review.
Thank you for having me here today. No disclosures, I'm going to be talking about spine trauma registries. In recent years, there's been a large emphasis or focus on trauma registries or arthroplasty registries and the use of them in determining patient outcomes, long-term outcomes of procedures, as well as complication rates. However, there's not much literature for specifically traumatic spinal injuries, and there aren't very many consensus statements on optimal treatment or expected outcomes for a lot of these traumatic spinal injuries. So a lot of registries have popped up in the last couple of decades, and these can be used to address some knowledge gaps that can help both providers and patients in terms of determining treatment, potential complications associated with these, as well as long-term outcomes. And registries are a place where all of these data points can be conglomerated across a large group of patients in order to answer this. However, there is a large cost in creating and maintaining these registries, and there is little to no insight in individual downstream utilization and benefits of these registries, both within our country as well as internationally. So the purpose of the study was to assess the impact and utility of spine trauma registries. We conducted a comprehensive search across multiple databases, including international databases such as Embase, to include national or multi-institutional databases. Of note, we excluded state-specific ones as well as institution-specific ones, or things like the Kaiser Registry, because those were not available to most people to utilize for research. And we looked specifically at whether they included sequelae of acute trauma to the spine or spinal cord, and we also made sure that it was primary research rather than meta-analyses and things like that. Exclusion criteria, like I mentioned here, included single institution or private databases, anything that was degenerative or congenital based unless acute trauma was involved, any pathologic fractures, and like I mentioned, any meta-analyses or systematic reviews. We ended up with a total of 46 registries internationally that met inclusion criteria. As you can see, a majority of them are based in the United States. 11 countries only had a single registry focused on spinal trauma outcomes. And then we ended up doing a PRISMA analysis, which basically extracted all articles related to spine trauma that utilized these registries. Lots of numbers up here, but the biggest ones are there were a total of 87,000, a little bit more than 87,000 studies that were imported. And then we went through and manually screened with 2 reviewers looking at each study, as well as a tie break if needed. And 48,000 studies ended up passing our inclusion criteria. And out of these, once we dove deeper into the abstract to really assess the population that was included and the outcomes they studied, only 511 full-text studies were imported, of which we analyzed 494 studies. Of these, 23 ended up being excluded once we actually got to the article to analyze them. And it ended up being that only 18 registries were represented in those 494 articles, of which most of them didn't have that many publications total. 13 of them had, 5 of them had only less than 5 publications total. And this is kind of a graph of the number of publications over time. As you can see, over the years, the number of publications has increased, but even as recently as 2020, there's only about 20 articles being put out by these registries that are considered high volume in the study. And you can see here the biggest ones are the Rick Hansen Spinal Cord Registry that's based out of Canada, the SCIMS Registry that's based out of the USA, and then a couple of other ones. The NISQIP database actually is interesting. I listed here because it's not a specific spinal cord database, a spinal cord injury database. It, as you all know, has a lot more different outcomes, but it ended up being one of the more utilized registries in terms of publication output for spine trauma. So I bring this up to say that a lot of these large multi-center national registries with 50,000 patients or more cost millions of dollars to maintain every year in personnel, infrastructure, data quality, operations. And if you look at the utility of these registries over the years, there's very little publications that actually utilize the data that's being inputted into it. There's very little validation that's being done into quality of data, into the type of metrics that are being used in these publications. Of the 46 registries analyzed, only 6 had more than 5 articles published, less than 1 paper per year in regards to spine trauma. So the point of this paper is basically to maybe emphasize that we need to reconsider the resources maintaining these 46 registries and rather consolidate them and create perhaps a more centralized database, whether that's NISQIP or something else, to allow for more accurate and updated data that can then be utilized. Limitations, this is of course a literature review. Like I mentioned, we did exclude like private databases or more state-based databases that might have more rigorous upkeep as well as usage, but again, it's not accessible to the majority of people that want to use it. And then finally, further studies are actually needed to determine the impact factor and number of citations per these publications that are being put out to see if it is actually useful research in the field or really delineate what's going on there. Thank you.
Okay, and last we have Dr. Okafor from Loyola University discussing Olympic participation and subsequent season injury occurrence in NBA athletes.
Hi, and thank you so much for having me here. No disclosures. So background on why this matters. So for elite athletes, Olympic participation, it introduces a unique scenario for them where they're in their transitional post-season period and they are exposed to this additional high-intensity competition where they would traditionally be in a recovery and preparation period for their next season. This includes condensed training camps, as well as international travel and subsequent workouts. The purpose of this study was to isolate Olympic participation as a discrete workload exposure and evaluate its effect within the same athlete. We specifically examined differences in time loss injury, occurrence, availability, and performance metrics before and after Olympic competition. This was a retrospective study using publicly available data on Team USA NBA athletes from the years 1992 to 2016. Each Olympic participation was treated as a paired observation comparing the season immediately before and after. And injury was defined as at least one time loss injury resulting in missed games. The key finding of this study was that injury occurrence increased from 43% before Olympic participation to 58% after, representing a 15% absolute increase. Clinically, this translates to approximately 1 additional injured athlete for every 7 Olympic participants in this cohort. Did not reach statistical significance, but the magnitude is clear clinically. Despite the increase in injury occurrence, there weren't any significant differences in overall games played or games started or per game performance. This suggests that athletes are eventually able to recover and maintain a stable performance output on average, even in the setting of an increased workload. And sorry, I just went over that. This was supposed to be my limitations slide. I think I hit the wrong slide, but the limitations of this study were that We used publicly available data. It was a retrospective study, and this is also an elite cohort of professional athletes, so not necessarily the most generalizable. And as far as conclusion, Olympic participation was associated with an increase in subsequent injury occurrence without a significant decline in performance. These findings support the need for targeted workload management strategies in athletes returning from international competition anyway. Thank you.
All right, thanks to our presenters, and we are open for questions. Dr. O'Keefe.
Yeah, for Dr. Okafor, I'm wondering if you had a chance or have thought about the women, if there's any difference in the women Olympic athletes as well. Also foreign players for the NBA. You know, there's a lot of foreign players now in the NBA. If any insights about those two groups?
Just talking.
Because they were not on the USA team, so they were exposed to different workload regimens with their respective countries' teams. So it didn't seem necessary to include them in this cohort. We didn't really look into that. And as far as women, that is a study that we are interested in conducting in the future.
The pre-post periods you looked at, that was within a season, looking at before they played in the Olympics in that season and then after the Olympics in that season, or was it the season before they, so like the 92 Olympics, you looked at 91 and then 93?
Correct.
Okay.
Because 92 was the first year
Okay.
that men's basketball was included.
Dr. Burton.
For the spine trauma registries, you had to help put this context. Did you encounter the kind of instance of publications from other registries, particularly that spine trauma and upgrades using publications, or is this just a symptom of a larger problem that registries aren't supposed to be full of?
I think it's, like you mentioned, multifocal. If we compared it to the joints literature, because it's pretty robust in terms of registry use, and those are definitely more productive and also more streamlined in terms of the metrics that they use. But at the same time, spine trauma is also much more difficult to study because it's usually like a polytrauma patient and the metrics are not as well categorized or documented. So I think it's both of those.
I had a question for Dr. Cho. Thought your study was very interesting, looking at methylene blue for intraoperative detection. Given one of the results was that the CFU counts actually decrease with the use of methylene blue for certain organisms, do you think that would confound intraoperative detection if it has some kind of antimicrobial effect?
That's a good question. I don't think so. There have been a couple other studies that have found differences in that regard. And one translational study found that it did decrease the biofilm burden, but not to not to the extent that the organism was not culturable. For example, in one of the studies where they obtained stained versus unstained tissue samples in the PJI setting. So I think it's more a benefit of methylene blue is that it can have antimicrobial properties without totally rendering the bacteria unrecoverable.
Any further questions? All right. Thanks again to our presenters. Are we still doing a break?
I don't think we need a break. I think we
just go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah. So we'll continue on to the last session now. And this is going to be moderated by Dr. Rob Brophy and John O'Malley. Dr. Brophy being our attending surgeon, John O'Malley is joint arthroplasty. I'm sorry, this is joint arthroplasty session. John is one of our residents. Dr. Brophy is the division chief for sports medicine, and he oversees our orthopedic clinical research center and works really across all the divisions and department, help facilitate research. So Rob, I'll have you and John come forward to moderate. Thank you.
All right, as Dr. O'Keefe said, Jack O'Malley, one of the PGY2 residents here, introducing Dr. Gia from Cleveland Clinic. Going to be talking about preoperative psychiatric diagnosis that predict worse outcome and worse patient-reported outcome measures, higher dissatisfaction, and increased healthcare utilizations following total knee arthroplasties.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lori, and I'm excited to share our work on mental health as a predictor of total knee arthroplasty outcomes. Total knee arthroplasty is one of the most common and successful orthopedic procedures in the U.S. According to national data, the annual number of primary TKAs is estimated to exceed 1.2 million by the year 2040 and 2.9 million by the year 2060. Most patients do incredibly well after surgery and are able to return to their life and activities pain-free. Still, a small subset of patients are dissatisfied with their post-operative outcome, and we don't really know why. Early efforts focused on the impact of surgical factors, but found that dissatisfaction persisted even in the absence of complications. More recent efforts have looked at patient factors and found that patient factors more accurately predicted post-operative outcomes. Our team was interested in studying mental health as another potential patient factor. Specifically, we wanted to know whether a preoperative psychiatric diagnosis impacted post-operative total knee arthroplasty outcomes. We performed a retrospective review of all patients who underwent elective primary unilateral total knee arthroplasty at our institution between 2016 and 2022. Our primary variable of interest was the presence of psychiatric disease, and we secondarily looked at a variety of patient characteristics. Our postoperative variables included one-year patient-reported outcomes using the validated KOOS questionnaire. We additionally looked at healthcare utilization after surgery. Our study included a total of 13,894 patients who underwent 14,900 total knee arthroplasties. Over a quarter of patients had a preoperative psychiatric diagnosis. Depression in blue and anxiety in yellow were the most common standalone diagnoses. Many patients had multiple psychiatric diagnoses, as seen in purple. We then asked, what were these patients like? We found that patients with a preoperative psychiatric diagnosis tended to be younger, female, with a higher BMI, fewer years of education, more likely to smoke, more likely on Medicaid, with greater socioeconomic disadvantage and a greater number of comorbidities, all of which were statistically significant. Next, we found that a preoperative psychiatric diagnosis was independently associated with failure to achieve the minimally clinically important difference in KOOS physical function at 1 year postoperatively, as well as failure to achieve the patient-acceptable symptom state across all KOOS domains at 1 year postoperatively. Our subgroup analysis further demonstrated that patients with multiple psychiatric diagnoses had even higher odds of failing to achieve the patient-acceptable symptom state across KOOS domains. And finally, we found that patients with a preoperative psychiatric diagnosis had significant higher odds of a longer length of stay, non-home discharge, and 90-day hospital readmission, all of which were statistically significant. So what's next? Our study found that a preoperative psychiatric diagnosis predicted worse 1 year patient-reported outcomes and increased healthcare utilization after total knee arthroplasty surgery. These findings highlight the burden of mental health not only on patients, but also on providers, hospitals, and the healthcare system at large. In other words, mental health matters. Our data further suggests that early identification of at-risk patients and a multidisciplinary approach to their care may improve outcomes for this key patient population. Patient counseling with appropriate expectation management before surgery is important. Preoperative optimization of mental and physical health, as well as post-operative individualized care pathways, could also be helpful. Further research is necessary to identify the efficacy of these proposed interventions, but I myself am optimistic. Thank you very much.
Hello, as Dr. O'Keefe mentioned, I'm Rob Brophy, one of the faculty here, and I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Emily Reeson from Rush University, who will talk about how early postoperative periprosthetic fractures after total hip arthroplasty are associated with higher complication and revision risk than intraoperative fractures.
Hi, everyone. My name is Emily Reeson, and today I'll be talking about post-op periprosthetic fractures in the setting of total hip arthroplasty. First, some background on this topic. As we know, the total number of total hip arthroplasty procedures are increasing in the United States. And as the total number of procedures increase, so do the total number of complications. One of which being periprosthetic fractures. These are known to be associated with high patient morbidity, mortality, and financial burden, both on the patient and the hospital system as a whole. One portion of periprosthetic fractures occur intraoperatively, and the incidence of these have increased with the use of press-fit femoral stems. These fractures, while they can be addressed at the time of the index arthroplasty procedure, are still known to be associated with higher complications as compared to those with no fracture during the index procedure. It is thought that a portion of periprosthetic fractures that occur intraoperatively go undetected, and those recognized in the early postoperative period are thought to be those that are left undetected and then later found. These have been associated with worse outcomes than those with uncomplicated primary total hip arthroplasty. However, these patients have never been compared to those with detected intraoperative fractures. So we sought to, in this study, compare outcomes of primary total hip arthroplasty patients with intraoperative periprosthetic fractures as compared to those with fractures identified in the early postoperative period. And we hypothesized that periprosthetic fractures identified in the early postoperative period would be associated with a higher number of complications than those addressed intraoperatively. To do so, we completed a large retrospective national database analysis using the Pearl Diver database. We included primary total hip arthroplasty patients from the year 2010 to 2023. We excluded those total hip arthroplasties, patients with bilateral hip replacements, those performed for revision total hip arthroplasty, and any done for fracture or oncology diagnoses. Intraoperative periprosthetic fractures were diagnosed or identified using CPT codes, documented on post-op day 1 or 0, and then early postoperative fractures were those that were identified in the first 30 days after surgery. We then matched these cohorts on a variety of comorbidities and resulted in 932 patients per cohort. We then looked at outcomes both at 90 days and 2 years. So what did we find? First, at 90 days, we found that those with early periprosthetic fractures had a higher number of a variety of complications, as you can see outlined here, compared to those with fractures identified intraoperatively. And we found similar findings at 2 years. Every single complication that we looked at 2 years were higher in the early fracture group as compared to those in the intraoperative fracture group. So what does this mean? Overall, we found periprosthetic fractures identified early postoperatively were associated with significantly worse outcomes, both at 90 days and 2 years. Overall, this comes to show the importance of both intraoperative fracture prevention and identification during the primary arthroplasty procedure. Together, this study comes to show future directions may be wise to look at the utilization of intraoperative imaging as well as routine post-op radiograph surveillance in order to better identify these fractures and prevent the complications associated with fractures that go undetected. Thank you.
All right, and next up is Dr. Mangal Pari from the University of Illinois at Chicago, talking about increased force and contact area in the lateral compartment may predispose to arthritis progression after balanced unis, a cadaveric comparison.
Thank you so much for having me. My name is Nirav. I'm an intern at University of Illinois at Chicago. Today I'm presenting a cadaveric study evaluating the load distribution after balanced unicompartment knee arthroplasty, which title is up here as my slide. We received a grant from corporate sponsor for implant and cadaveric for this project. So why UK matters? So unicompartment knee arthroplasty offer several well-established advantages, including faster recovery, less blood loss, and improved function, same as total knee arthroplasty. Importantly, short-term outcome can be compared to total knee. However, despite this benefit, UKA continues to demonstrate 2 to 3-fold higher higher risk of the lifetime revision. And the most common cause of this UKA failure is aseptic loosening, pain in replaced compartment, and progression of the arthritis in unreplaced compartment. So given the higher revision rate seen after unicompartment knee arthroplasty, we sought to determine whether the load distribution differs between the medial replaced compartment and the lateral native compartment or not. Specifically, we wanted to identify biomechanical changes that may help explain the persistently higher failure rate seen in the unicompartment knee arthroplasty. And also we asked if there is any difference between conventional UKA or robotic assisted UKA. So in method, there is a control time 0 cadaveric study using a 16 fresh frozen human lower limb specimen. Only knees with mild to moderate medial compartment arthritis was included, while specimen with advanced arthritis, prior surgeries, or major pathology were excluded. We used pilot measurement from first 4 knees and get the prior power analysis. And based on that, our minimum specimen required was 11, and we included 16, so we achieved 88% of power in our study. So specimen preparation were then random. All the specimen were then randomly allocated either in the conventional UKA or CORI robotic assisted UKA with 8 specimen in each group. To quantify the compartment mechanics, we used the FlexiForce TAC scan sensor placed in a both compartment, and in medial replace compartment, we put that sensor beneath the femoral component, and in the native lateral compartment, we placed that between the femur and native meniscus. And measurement was done through 90-degree flexion to full extension. An outcome we recorded as a contact pressure, contact area, and peak forces. It is demonstrated in this video. So what we found, our first key finding was that contact pressure was persistently higher in medial replaced compartment. As the knee moved towards the extension, medial pressure increased nearly 4-fold from approximately 252 kilopascal to 1864 kilopascal. In contrast, lateral compartment, it showed substantially lower pressure. So for the contact area, where the pattern reversed, the lateral native compartment consistently demonstrated larger contact area at every flexion angle, while medial compartment area remained relatively constant. Lateral contact area increased substantially toward the extension. Again, no significant difference between the robotic and conventional UKA. And finally, the force, the lateral compartment consistently bore greater load. Force increased from approximately 26 to 98 newtons and remained higher in the medial compartment across the entire arc of motion. And this pattern persistently, regardless the robotic assistant or not. So interpretation is, this finding suggests that the even well-balanced UKA may not restore the physiological load sharing, but there is a persistent biomechanical mismatch. In the medial compartment, there is a higher pressure which compared to the lateral one, which is a possible cause of prosthetic loosening. And in lateral compartment, we have higher force and higher contact area, which is a possible reason for the lateral compartment degeneration. A potential biomechanical explanation for this higher UKA failure rate, robotic assisted did not alter this pattern. So there are a lot of limitations in our study. This study, first, there is a time 0 cadaveric model, does not fully replicate the in vivo muscle and ligament or biological condition. Second, we only tested medial UKA. Third, testing was performed under passive motion, and we did not stratify coronal knee phenotypes like varus, valgus, or neutral. But this data does provide some foundational study for the future direction, and the future direction should be a simulated weight-bearing models with involving more phenotypic specific analysis and transition to more in vivo and long-term outcomes. I would like to thank Dr. Amirush's UIC Biomechanical Lab for the support of this work and all the engineers and all the collaborators to make this study possible. Thank you very much.
And now we will hear from our own Dr. Brian Song. Is inflammatory arthritis an absolute indication for patella resurfacing and total knee arthroplasty?
Good morning. Thank you to the OREF. I'll be talking about the role for patellar resurfacing and inflammatory arthritis. No relevant disclosures for this study. And so the management of the patella in primary total knee arthroplasty remains a controversial topic. The clinical practice guidelines from the Academy strongly supported that there is evidence that shows no difference between resurfaced and non-resurfaced patella after a primary total knee arthroplasty. Additionally, the most recent AJRR report has demonstrated a declining rate of patellar resurfacing over the past decade. And importantly, previous absolute indications, one of which for patellar resurfacing has been inflammatory arthritis. However, with the advent and rise of DMARD usage, this has really revolutionized care for patients with inflammatory arthritis to the point where these patients are achieving similar outcomes after total knee replacement, and additionally, their preoperative radiographs demonstrate similar phenotypes to osteoarthritis patients. So the purpose of this study was twofold. First was to compare outcomes after total knee arthroplasty without patellar resurfacing for patients with inflammatory arthritis and osteoarthritis. And additionally, we compared outcomes of total knee arthroplasty in patients with inflammatory arthritis with and without patellar resurfacing. This was a retrospective review over a 7-year period of all the surgeons included. 8 of 9 utilized a selective resurfacing protocol, while 1 routinely resurfaced all patella. And patients included in the inflammatory arthritis cohorts had a diagnosis made by a rheumatologist and were previously treated with DMARD therapy, and a minimum of 1-year follow-up was required. We identified 348 inflammatory arthritis patients who were matched to a cohort of osteoarthritis patients based on demographics. And we also identified 38 inflammatory arthritis patients who did have patellar resurfacing performed. Our primary outcomes included reoperations, revisions, patella-related complications, and the presence of anterior knee pain. Overall, there were no significant differences in the demographics that were matched between the OA and inflammatory arthritis cohorts. However, the inflammatory arthritis patients did have a higher tendency of a greater ASA classification. Both groups had a follow-up of around 2 years. The non-matched resurfaced inflammatory group was slightly younger and had a little bit longer follow-up time. Otherwise, they were pretty similar. So when looking at the inflammatory arthritis group, comparing with their matched osteoarthritis cohort, we didn't find any differences in reoperations, patella-related complications, or the presence of anterior knee pain. The rate of anterior knee pain was about 5 to 7% and was not different between the two groups. And when looking specifically within inflammatory arthritis, with and without patellar resurfacing, there were no differences in reoperations for patella-related complications. And further, there was no difference in anterior knee pain. We did find a higher rate of aseptic reoperations for reasons other than the patella in the resurfaced group. In conclusion, there were no significant differences in reoperations, revisions, or patella-related complications or anterior knee pain in total knee arthroplasty for inflammatory arthritis without patellar resurfacing when compared to a controlled cohort of osteoarthritis. Additionally, patellar resurfacing did not have improved outcomes for patients with inflammatory arthritis. And the results suggest that inflammatory arthritis should not be considered an absolute indication for patellar resurfacing in total knee arthroplasty. Thank you.
And our last speaker of the day is Dr. Alfonsi from Rush, talking to us about GLP-1 agonists versus bariatric surgery prior to total hip arthroplasty.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sam Alfonsi. I'm one of the second-year residents at Rush. I want to thank Dr. Burnett and all the arthroplasty folks at Midwest Ortho for supporting this study. It's titled GLP-1 agonists versus bariatric surgery prior to total hip arthroplasty, which management option carries heavier weight. There are no relevant disclosures. We all know that obesity is a well-known risk factor for PGI, mechanical complications, and poor patient-reported outcomes prior to total hip arthroplasty. Knowing these risks is often the arthroplasty surgeon is the one advising these patients on different weight loss modalities. Bariatric surgery, though pretty invasive, significantly reduces our BMI, but recent studies have shown that GLP-1 agonists has similar weight loss with fewer adverse effects. Specific to total joint arthroplasty, GLP-1s have been shown in a recent systematic review in December that it decreases your rates of PGI, readmissions, and wound complications specific to total joint arthroplasty. So given this promising data surrounding GLPs, it makes sense to compare the two options, because at current, there's no consensus that exists on whether medical or surgical weight loss yields superior postoperative outcomes following total hip arthroplasty. Thus, the purpose of our study was to compare 90-day postoperative complication rates following THAs in patients who underwent medical weight loss with GLPs versus those who underwent bariatric surgery prior to total hip arthroplasty. This was a TriNetX Research Network study that utilized a retrospective cohort study design from 2005 to 2025. We looked at patients who underwent bariatric surgery 6 months to 1 year before total hip arthroplasty, and we matched those 1-to-1 with those who used GLP during that same time interval. We included all patients with at least 90-day follow-up and those that had a BMI of at least 30 that was captured within 6 weeks of the weight loss intervention initiation to make sure that we had an obese BMI at the start of the study period. We looked at different medical and surgical complication risks, such as revisions and readmissions within that 90-day period, and we used univariate analysis for our p-values. For our demographics, after baseline propensity score matching, we had 748 patients in each group. After matching, there was no difference in baseline demographics or medical comorbidities, though the GLP-1 group had a slightly higher starting BMI than the bariatric surgery group. Moving on to our results. For our medical complications, there's no differences. The crux of our results here are the surgical complications. After 90 days, there was a 50% decrease in odds of PGI in the GLP-1 group. And then when looking at our composite complications, we found that at 90 days, there was a decrease in any complication or readmission in the GLP-1 group. And then there was also a 25% decrease in odds in any surgical complication in the GLP-1 group as well. So in conclusion, patients in the GLP-1 group had lower 90-day complication rates, namely lower odds of PGI, any complication or readmission, and any surgical complication. A couple of salient points to discuss here. In 2016, our arthroplasty division looked at hypoalbuminemia and found that it independently predicts surgical site infections. So it kind of begs the question, do these micronutrient deficiencies such as anemias, B12 deficiencies, are these the explanatory effect that has these higher rates of PGI seen in the bariatric surgery group? Do these GLP-1 agonists completely, totally get rid of these micronutrient deficiencies, or does a longer time of GLP-1 use or the timing of GLP-1 use prior to total hip arthroplasty also have a poor impact on a patient's wound healing profile? We can also look at peri-incisional adiposity. There was a talk earlier today that touched on this well, but whether that adiposity is centrally or peripherally located after these interventions are completed, I think that's something that we can look to in the future. But overall, our findings suggest that GLP-1 agonists may represent a safer, less invasive alternative for preoperative total hip arthroplasty weight management without increasing postoperative risk. Thank you.
Thank you to all our speakers for some excellent presentations. Do we have any questions from the audience? Regis.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Really great presentations by the group. Dr. Afonso, in your work, I'm interested in whether or not you could look at glucose control in a perioperative period, because it's so important with, we understand now with infection and where GLP-1 patients better controlled from a glucose standpoint than those that had the surgery.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. We couldn't do that in a database study, but I do think the GLP-1 agonists themselves, you're losing more muscle than fat. It's been shown in these studies that both the oral and injectables, you're losing more of a metabolically active tissue, which I think is important in terms of insulin sensitivity and you said glucose control. So looking at preoperative CGM data that could get their current glucose control prior to, or say like a couple weeks prior to surgery, would be something that would be pretty apropos to this study. I think the tissue that you lose with that weight is important to look at. So you're losing the metabolically active tissue, which you allude to. So I think it's an important point to bring up.
So, Dr. Reason, I have a question for you. Looking at your data, it seems like the early, or the ones that weren't caught right away, seem to do just a bit worse. So is there a way that your team in particular is evaluating these possible fractures in the operating room, like visual inspection, x-ray, or anything in particular that you guys are doing routinely?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a couple things. One, just knowing who's at greater risk for these fractures in the first place. And so you're thinking about, surgeons who are utilizing implants that are at greater risk of these fractures, the press fit stems, and then as well as patient characteristics, older age, women, those with poor bone quality. And so I think just in talking with the surgeons in our department, if they know that their patient is at higher risk, I think they're just a little bit more on alert. But I think most importantly, there's a low threshold in these patients to get intraoperative imaging, call in X-ray, and then maintain good visualization of the field, especially of the calcar, I think is another thing that they've talked about is really important for these patients.
Great. Dr. Song, I had a quick question for you from the limited sports medicine perspective. Especially today, you see these inflammatory arthritis patients, but often their knee seems to be much more of a degenerative phenotype. So I guess my question would be, did you guys do a sub-analysis of that? Were they truly inflammatory arthritis in the knee? Or was it, it often looks like garden variety, degenerative OA when you see these patients. Did you guys look at that at all?
Not to the point where we analyzed it, but certainly looking through the preoperative x-rays, I would say the vast majority did appear phenotypically like osteoarthritis and as less like the classic picture of the inflammatory arthritis knee where you had significant degradation. So I think with the DMARD treatments, as all patients had, they phenotypically presented similar to osteoarthritis.
Which may reflect some of the findings. Yeah, thank you. Well, yes, Dr. Aleem.
Yeah, just a follow-up question. Just comment on selection bias. We're at an institution that heavily favors against patella resurfacing. I was telling Dr. Boyer I did less than 20 patella resurfacings my entire residency and more than 200 total knee arthroplasties. So we're completely different than the national averages that you're showing. 89% of surgeons still doing that. So how that goes into it, and I think to Dr. Brophy's point too, it may be tagged with diagnosis of RA, but it doesn't look like RA. So what was the indications for patella resurfacing? And is it hard to parse out in your study design?
Yeah, I think the majority of the RA patients that were resurfaced were by the surgeon who resurfaced all patellas routinely. And there were a couple where, based intraoperatively on the quality of the patellar cartilage, the decision was made to resurface. But certainly agree that the result of that institutional bias led to the small sample size of the resurfaced group. We only had 38 as opposed to 350 of the actual non-resurfaced patients of interest.
Great, thank you.
So we're going to begin with the Presenter Choice Awards, and I'm going to turn it over to you to go ahead and do this presentation. So one of the residents here will do the presentation, and I think I mentioned Kate Giroux previously was a national award winner. So Kate is going to present the Choice Award by all of you.
Thank you. So the Presenter's Choice Award, which comes with a $600 prize, goes to Dr. Heather Yee for the effects of isolated zone 5 extensor tendon fight bite injuries on finger range of motion should we repair partial lacerations. Congratulations, Heather.
So Dr. Brogan is now going to present 3 honorable mention awards. It actually turns out there were 2 honorable mention awards, but it's too close. So we decided to give 3, and Washington University is contributing one of these awards. I also want to mention to Dr. Yee, but also the other award winners, that when you're done, make sure you just check with Carmen up front before you leave, because she wants to make sure she has the correct address to send you the check. So we'll make sure it gets in the mail very quickly. So, but Dr. Brogan is going to present the 3 honorable mention awards. Each of these comes with a $500 award. David?
Excellent. All right, so these are in no particular order. Dr. Elizabeth Cho from Loyola University Medical Center for her talk in methylene blue as a biofilm disclosing agent for fracture-related infection and in vitro evaluation. Dr. Cho. we have everybody stand up here. Congratulations. And we'll have the next one come up. All right. Okay, let's do one individually. Go ahead. Great. All right. Next up, for honorable mention, is Dr. Nithya Lingampally from Loyola, also on her talk on the impact of spine trauma registries, a systematic review. Dr. Lingampally. Okay. All right. So we will get her award in a moment. Perfect. All right. And then our final honorable mention for today goes to Dr. Michael Scheidt from also from Loyola for reverse shoulder arthroplasty for proximal humerus fractures and reverse shoulder arthroplasty for elective indications should have separate CPT codes. Congratulations. Thank you. Give you that.
Okay, so well, no, we'll get one of it. Okay, so now we're going to give out the third, the second, and then the first place awards. And I think these come with monetary awards, I believe, of $750, $800, and $1,000. So, and I think all three of you then are in the national competition. So, again, we'll move on to a national competition and opportunity to get national level awards. So, the third place awardee is Brian Song from Washington University School of Medicine. His inflammatory arthritis, an absolute indication for patellar resurfacing in total knee arthroplasty. Right. David, you want to come in the picture? Okay. Great. Okay, terrific. The second place awardee is Kylene Georgian, Rush University Medical Center, preliminary outcomes of scapholunate interosseous ligament reconstruction using the button-assisted internal brace technique. Okay, and the first place awardee is Lori Jha from Cleveland Clinic. Preoperative psychiatric diagnosis predicts worse patient-reported outcome measures, higher dissatisfaction, increased healthcare utilization following total knee arthroplasty, analysis of over 13,000 patients. Okay, we'll have all the award winners done for a picture, and then we'll conclude our session. As they're coming down, I do want to also, again, thank the OREF for this event. You can stay here, but we'll have a picture. So all the award winners should come down for a picture. You can come forward. But I want to thank the OREF for sponsoring this. Obviously, the Hark family, who provided our sponsorship for memory of Dr. Fred Hark and Dr. William Hark. So really want to also thank them, and Lee, you and your team being here in St. Louis, terrific. So thank you all for attending today, and I hope you leave here with fond memories of Washington University, and maybe I'm sure we will see you all again. It's a small community being an orthopedic surgeon. You'll see each other, and maybe someday you'll join our faculty. So fingers crossed. Okay, how's that? Thank you so much.